Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to Decision 2025.
And I'm Creeson Agecoutay. After a 36-day campaign, the shortest time frame a campaign can go, election night for this 45th federal election is here. Over the next 3 hours, we will bring you the results from the 343 federal ridings, and we will also be checking in with our reporters live from some of those key ridings.
We have our reporters out in the field from coast to coast, including at the headquarters of Liberal leader Mark Carney, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Also, on the left side of your screen, you will see the seats that each party is leading or elected in, and the ticker box on the bottom will show the election results of about 70 ridings and how many votes have been counted in real time, including the party leaders, the 36 ridings identified by the Assembly of First Nations, and a number of other ridings where Indigenous people are on the ballot.
We also have some great guests helping us out tonight. First in studio, we have Cassidy Caron, the former president of the APTN National Council, who is now a principal consultant with First Peoples Group. Joining us via Zoom from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan is Jennifer Leywitz, the CEO of Pasquale Strategies, and one of our regular panelists on the Truth in Politics panel. Also with us via Zoom, the other half of the Truth in Politics panel, Winnipeg Free Press columnist Gazan Sinclair, who is in Toronto tonight.
We also have the host of Nouvelle Nationale, Kim Sullivan, in our Ottawa studio with two special guests. Kim, how's it going over there?
Hi, Dennis. Hi, Creeson. Very exciting night, especially knowing that the winner of tonight, our next Prime Minister, will be winning right here in our city. And I'm not alone in our national capital. We actually have two very special guests right here in studio. The first Inuk ever elected as an MP and an expert on electoral politics. We have Peter Idawar. Hello. And we also have political science professor at McGill University, Veldon Coburn. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be looking forward at everything that is going to happen tonight. A little discussion back and forth. There is a lot to tackle, but of course we are handing it over to you right now in Winnipeg.
Thanks so much, Kim. Well, here we are after a 36-day campaign. Cassidy, what sticks out for you from this election campaign?
Honestly, I think it's mostly the whirlwind of political activity that happened before the election. You know, we had the Conservative Party really leading in the polls. The resignation of Prime Minister Trudeau, the Liberal Party leadership race, and then Mark Carney being the Prime Minister for about 9 days before calling this election. So for me, what struck me is just the unpredictability always of politics, and then how the polls have shifted. So really looking forward to seeing what happens tonight.
Gazan, what's your thoughts on how this election campaign played out?
Well, it's all Donald Trump. It's how leaders will handle Donald Trump. And for little gaps in the campaign, Donald Trump went silent, probably focused on, situations, for example, in Ukraine and elsewhere. And then we saw the issues of the campaign actually come to the surface for about a week or so. And that was issues of affordability. That was issues of, the past 10 years of Liberal rule that for Indigenous peoples is probably the most progressive federal government in history. And then, of course, some of the major issues that involve things like resource use and the fact that both leading federal parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, are both driving a mostly resource-based agenda, going to be very aggressive. Again, returning back to the first topic that I talked about, which was Donald Trump. And by all signs, it looks as though Mark Carney's party is heading to victory, but it's very tight, especially in Maritimes right now. And so it's going to be a very exciting evening.
Jennifer, anything memorable for you from this campaign?
Yeah, I think this is the first campaign that we've seen digital involvement at the height of what it has been. In previous election years, we've seen what the Liberals and Conservatives look like during election time. And I think now more than ever, we're seeing that play out on social media, whether it be influencers, whether it be political talking heads. But that piece we're also seeing is whether or not the parties could keep it held together on their internal issues becoming public. the Liberals have been infamous at being able to keep a lot of their issues that are happening internally away from the public eye. This campaign seemed pretty lock and key. We didn't hear about a lot of drama facing the forefront. We actually didn't even really know about a lot of the high-level people involved in their campaigns. But then we saw all of the issues that the Conservatives seem to have come to the table. We saw Doug Ford leaks coming to the table, where that conversation between Premier Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre was hitting the news. We're seeing fights between, a political correspondent that's pretty high level within the party, Jenny Byrne, and her issues with that Corey gentleman. Like, it's been very interesting to see how the Liberals were able to almost navigate what that looks like in modern time, and the Conservatives still seem to not be able to get it together.
And Cassidy, did you hear much in the way of Métis-specific priorities are being addressed during this campaign?
Verbally, no. Throughout, it was a short election time, so of course the promises, the announcements that they were making are very pointed, very broad, wanting to just attack most of those priorities that my panelists spoke about here. So verbally, no, we didn't hear a lot that the Métis Nation was looking for within the platforms that were released really only a week ago, which was too bad. There was some of the promises that we were looking for. Specifically, though, when we're talking about Indigenous issues within an election, making sure that we're hearing from the leaders that distinctions-based language and making sure that they understand that there are First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and we have unique priorities across this country. So verbally, I wasn't hearing that at all from any of the leaders within the platforms, here and there, mostly in the Liberal Party platform. It was really parsed out, others not so much.
We did hear Mark Carney say Métis a couple of times, but I don't think he was actually talking about us. Niigaan, another thing that we didn't hear much about, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of the release of the TRC's final report. Been pointed out a few times, no mention really of the TRC, no mention of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Are you surprised that these types of issues were left off the table this time around?
Well, again, it is a short campaign. But what I would say, it's not to excuse that in any way, but it's to say that Donald Trump has really sucked the oxygen out of the entire election campaign. For the most part, because both parties are based in an economic agenda, what they're predominantly doing is they're predominantly talking about, we are the best party to face off against Donald Trump to build Canada's economy. The other thing that you really didn't see a whole lot of is the dealing with the environmental crisis. And which is for Indigenous peoples, we know that we are disproportionately impacted when it comes to forest fires, when it comes to flooding. There are little elements within the platforms that sort of tip off that there are elements of what we might think of during with the TRC, the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report. For instance, the Liberal Party has committed to Indigenous rights, whereas the Conservatives do talk about a First Nations resource charge, an optional charge, but then don't mention the word Indigenous rights at all in their platform. That's a little bit suspicious, especially considering Pierre Poilievre recently was the leader who went and spoke to the AFN, so kudos on that, but then did not endorse Indigenous rights, said he was more suspicious about it. So we start to see little splinters that go in between the two leading federal parties in relation to issues that the TRC raised. But yes, absolutely, the TRC did not receive a lot of attention. Absolutely, the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry received almost no attention in any of the party platforms, with the exception of the NDP, who did mention it. And then the bigger issue of all is how do we deal with this environmental crisis, which inevitably impacts Indigenous peoples when we, pipeline, build mines, drill for lithium, et cetera, et cetera.
Jennifer, economic reconciliation has come up a lot, especially by the Conservative Party. Do you see this as a major priority for nations?
I honestly can't say in good conscience that I see this as a major priority. I know there are First Nations out there that are actively participating in resource development. And I know, the National Loan Guarantee Program was something that nations did want. But at the same time, from what I'm seeing on the ground in Saskatchewan, there's a lot of other priorities at the forefront right now. And some of those things are like addiction strategies. Child welfare is huge. Nations are currently standing by, waiting to figure out what happens next, because that capacity building funding, we don't know where we're going from here. You had that Supreme Court ruling that reaffirmed the jurisdiction over child welfare. So where's the support? Where's the resources post 2025? So that's where a lot of that conversation is. And I know that will open up conversations down the road on issues like resource development when we start talking about how do we actually create capacity to drive revenue to our nations to actually pay for that sovereignty that we're advocating for. And I think that there are a lot of ways we can get involved in economic development in this country. It doesn't necessarily need to be pipelines, but it is concerning when that seems to be the route that a lot of conservative politicians are promoting right now when, consent and consultation isn't at the forefront of their agenda.
Cassidy, Nigon mentioned the environment there. Thunder Bay's under a flood watch tonight, saying that might affect polls there. There's forest fires already starting out west. Do you think maybe if this election was a few more weeks down the road that environment might be brought up a little more?
Certainly. I think there's definitely always a time within the year that the climate crisis really hits the news, and it is during forest fire season. And time again, we hear leaders say, we're having another unprecedented forest fire season, and we know it's coming, so let's talk about it sooner. If it was during the forest fire season, I'm certain that it would be talked about, but unfortunately, it didn't get raised at all this year.
Nigon, are there some races here that you're really paying close attention to?
Yeah, there's very key. I wrote about this in my column to say, if you're curious of where the Indigenous vote is going to go, watch those two ridings in northern Saskatchewan. The other one is in northern Manitoba. Very significant, over near 50% First Nations voters, and then also dozens of Métis communities in both of those ridings. You're going to see a very interesting race. In Saskatchewan, what you see an all-Indigenous candidate slate. You see a battle between what will be across the country, between the Conservatives, between the Liberals. It is a long-standing riding that has been held by the Conservatives with a little bit of the NDP. The NDP vote's going to drop. And then what you're going to see is, will that be enough to push the Liberals over the edge? That's in northern Saskatchewan and northern Manitoba. You're going to see a really interesting fight between the Liberals and the Conservatives, between Nikki Ashton, longtime 17 years incumbent, for the NDP, and then newcomer, very popular Liberal, Rebecca Chartrand, who's widely expected to have a very important role within cabinet. Insiders tell me that if she makes it, if she gets voted in, she will be at the table with Mark Carney to certainly be forefront for that agenda. She's a big stand on issues of murder, missing Indigenous women and girls, education, racism, and so on. And so watching those ridings, do Indigenous peoples in the northern Manitoba riding want to be inside of the room at the Liberal Party or be in an advocacy role with the NDP? That would be two ridings extremely important to watch, and I think will be indicative of most Indigenous vote in the country for this election. Northern Ontario is also going to be very interesting, and of course all in BC. BC is oftentimes kind of decided. The election's usually decided before we get our results in BC. Not this time. I think BC will have a major role, particularly Vancouver Island.
Cassidy, in about 15 minutes, roughly 2/3 of this country, the polls will be closed. Are there ridings that you've been keeping an eye on during this campaign you'll be watching for tonight?
Yeah, well, I mean, Indigenous ridings aside, we've got the party leaders ridings, so Carleton. For Pierre Poilievre, I know that one potentially is going to be a tight riding, as well as the NDP riding in Burnaby, or the NDP leaders riding in Burnaby, Jagmeet Singh. But when we're talking about Indigenous candidates, we're looking at Edmonton. We've got Edmonton Griesbach, that's Blake Desjardins running for the NDP. I know it's typically always been a Conservative riding. There was a turnover last election, and Blake got in and served as an MP, a Métis MP. So we're looking at that riding. And then, of course, as Nigon mentioned, the Northern Saskatchewan riding. We've got MLA Jim LeMay. He used to run with the Sask Party and unfortunately lost his seat. And so now he's running for the Conservative Party federally. And we've got Buckley Boulanger running for the Liberals. That riding has been changed with the riding redistribution as well. So it always has gone Conservative. But with the redistribution, there's a significant amount of Métis communities that have kind of been lumped into that riding. So we'll see what happens in Saskatchewan, maybe a little splotch of red.
Jennifer, the Assembly of First Nations had identified 36 ridings where First Nations could influence the outcome. Some of those aren't really close, but any of particular interest to you?
Yeah, like everyone else said, the Desnathay Miss Nippy Churchill riding is very close to home for me, and also was previously held by MP Gary Beadall, who I thought very, very highly of, and was very, very sad to actually see him resign. And it is interesting because of the historical relationships in those ridings. Desnathay is that riding is half of the province of Saskatchewan, because geographically, there isn't a lot of people population wise, but geographically it's huge. So that is a riding that you have to be very, very close to understanding the population that live in that riding, because they're all Indigenous candidates. But we've talked about this on the Truth in Politics panel, where that relationship as Indigenous people is a lot different when it comes to politics, because there's the family dynamics, there's the who's who, what community are you from? Are you Métis? Are you First Nations? And Jim LeMay, is a former MLA, and so is Buckley Boulanger. So they've both had their time sitting in a political seat, and whether or not that history will help them push them over the edge will be interesting to see what that looks like. But yeah, that riding has bounced back and forth. Federally, it's been NDP, it's been Conservative, so it'll be interesting to see if it goes Liberal. And Chief Tammy Cook-Stearson did make that try to make it go Liberal a few years ago, and so we'll see if it happens tonight.
Quick check-in with all of our guests here. Everyone's thoughts on the early results so far. What is this something you guys were looking forward to or seeing with regards to these results that we're seeing on screen here?
Nigan, you want to lead us off?
Sure, yeah. Well, I said this before. I said in the Maritimes, all of, as I'm watching my phone here, I have very deep ties in hearing from the NDP and the Liberals. The Conservatives make it a habit not to really speak to media, and so I don't have a whole lot of connections with many insiders within the Conservative Party. But I can tell you that within Liberal headquarters, it's very nervous. Because they thought they would do a little bit better in the Maritimes. There's some insiders sort of talking about the early stages of what the 1997 federal election looked like when John Creeson swept to an immense majority government. Early on that night in 1997, the Liberals lost a lot of support in the Maritimes, but it turns out that they didn't need it. They turned out that Ontario was enough to make up that difference. The big question is, coming out of tonight, it's starting to look very similar to that the Liberals aren't doing quite as well in the Maritimes. Jaime Batiste, for those of you who are following Indigenous candidates for tonight, looks like he's handily getting onto his seat. But the Liberals are in a much tighter fight in the Maritimes than what's looked like, and we're just getting our results coming in for Quebec. If it's tight in Quebec, we may be looking to minority territory for the Liberals. We're a little early on to make any decisions in that direction, but early signs show that this is going to be a very tight federal election.
Thank you, Nigan. Now it's time to check in with our hosts in Ottawa, Kim Sullivan. Kim?
Thanks, Dennis and Creeson. Polls have closed in the Atlantic region. We're about 10-15 minutes away from them closing here in Ontario and Quebec. So perfect timing to jump in with our guest right now. And I will start with you, Veldon. The polls suggest that there's been a tightening. The Conservatives got a bit closer to the Liberals towards Election Day, towards today. How much should Carney be concerned about that?
Well, I think depending on where the margins are tight, it was a bit of a runaway back in early January, just as we're coming into New Year's Day, where it seemed like Pierre Poilievre was going to have one of the largest majorities in Canadian history, and it was almost a 25-point lead, and if you take the polls seriously. But here we are talking about the polls, and in the last couple of days anyways, the fortunes had reversed over the campaign, or especially since the resignation of Justin Trudeau, the Liberal leadership run where current Prime Minister Mark Carney's in, and that reversal of fortunes, where you see the Liberals start spiking up quite a bit at the expense of the NDP, as we're finding out tonight, and holding on to those gains, but overcoming the Conservatives, overcoming a 25% or 25-point deficit. And begin to lead by 6-7 points, but that has closed, as you said. So it's tightened up. Many of the pollsters are looking at 1 point at the lowest end, upwards of 5 points. So if you meet in the middle somewhere, it might be 3 or 4 points, depending on how they weigh their regional representation and their sampling. You might have a runaway in certain areas, as we know the Conservatives are very strong in the prairie provinces, both in Saskatchewan and in Alberta. So that may weigh heavily in the overall popular vote, in which they've won in the last 2 elections. But doesn't translate to seats. So they have closed a bit of the gap. So we'll see. Yes,
exactly. What would another Liberal minority look like, especially without the support of the NDP?
Yeah, so that's difficult because you might have what you would think is the Conservatives who are sitting there as the government in waiting. So for 9 years, and now might have to be more antagonistic to win over some votes. As we know, this is an election that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives were almost braying for because they were willing to pull the trigger, and it was basically with the support of Jagmeet Singh and the NDP that were holding it together until sort of letting it go, like whatever sort of unofficial sort of agreement they have for supply and confidence. You would see them probably a bit antsy, but you got to make it work. But if without the NDP, you might not have that end of the spectrum to shore up sort of the social issues that the Conservatives would not otherwise.
Good point, which is why we're going to bring up the NDP. One last question before I get to you, Peter, but how bad would it be if the NDP can't get their minimum 12 seats and then don't get official status?
Yeah, so in parliamentary proceedings and the official recognition, that comes with some financial allowances and perks too, depending on, you can look at the seating arrangement in the House of Commons as one thing, but it's also the finance that supports the research for policy development and advocacy and your place within committees as well too. So it's hard to say if the polls are any indication that they might not quite make it so, but Peter being one of the first Inuk NDP.
I was going to ask, what do you think of Veldon's analysis here?
Well, I was itching to jump in a little bit. I have been in a situation myself where the NDP were in a propping up situation in 1979, 1980. The Joe Clark government fell because the NDP brought forward a motion of non-confidence after 9 months. And those situations are iffy. As you say, with the gap closing, it seemed, between right and left. The NDP, according to the polls, are going to be not gone, not quite gone, but not official either. And whether that leaves, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, whether that leaves the Bloc as the propping up party in the House is left to be seen. But one comment about this whole election. We talk about right and left and the closing of those gaps. I think a little bit in this election that comes into play is right from wrong. And because of the situation south of the border, people are voting strategically this time around. The hardcore right and the hardcore left will vote as they will. And the middle has been left, straddling. Wider and wider in a way, but at the same time, they're a commodity to vote for. If you have an ideology that has to do with environment, whatever the case may be, this time around, it's a defensive move against what's going on south of the border, and so I think some of it strategically is right from wrong. I'm voting right this time. Next time I'll vote the way I really want to. Something like that.
Could be true. It'll be interesting to see how that translates tonight. But with your experience, you have extensive experience in politics. Have you ever seen a situation where our neighbors down south are almost impacting our election this way?
Never. It's always one of diplomacy. It's always one of good neighborhood friendship, and except for at one point way back when John Diefenbaker was the prime minister, and I believe it was Dwight Eisenhower who called him and said, "Stop the Avro arrow." And since that time, though, it's always been one of good diplomatic relationships, good trade agreements, etc., etc. And now these unpredictable, if you will call them challenges or threats even, are coming on a daily basis. We had one today by Twitter or Instagram or whatever the case may be. I'm social media challenge, and it boggles the mind that that kind of thing is almost normal now, rather than being abnormal. And
if we think about the Indigenous vote, we talk about Turtle Island. It's there's no borders between us and our communities down south. Is that creating a friction there with these elections? And
well, I understand now that there are fewer candidates nationally of people running who are of Indigenous descent or Indigenous background, and I'm sad to hear that, because I've worked with Inuit organizations, I've worked with First Nations, I've worked with Métis, and I've always, in those areas where I've worked in my lifetime, I've always told First Nations, look, you have the numbers here to swing this riding. Influence comes at these places called legislatures and places around them, but in sometimes they very in friendly way tell me, well, we're First Nations, we don't want to participate in politics, and I think that's such an unfortunate situation. But
you mentioned swing riding. I want to talk about Nunavut. It is a swing riding. MPs from the Liberal, Conservative, most recently the NDP parties. Does it matter which party represents the territory when it comes to Ottawa? Do we care?
Whoever has the most relatives. No, I'm kidding. The first time I ran, 78, 79, I won by 76 votes. And if that is not indicative of a swing riding, I don't know what is. And since then, as you say, it's gone Conservative, it's gone Liberal, it's gone NDP, again Conservative, and et cetera. And a lot of factors are in. This is the first time I've ever heard of two candidates in Nunavut bashing each other through social media, and which is publicly. Because of policies or what they say they credit themselves with, and so that's the first. A little anecdote here: when I happened to stop in a place called Igloolik in my first campaign with Conservative candidate Agecoutay, we stayed at the same place. There was no cook there, so I cooked for him.
Oh, wow!
That's the kind of races you used to have up north. Now this bashing is brand new.
And it is happening in more than one riding. What ridings are you keeping an eye on, especially in Eastern Canada?
Well, I'm keeping an eye on where my home is. So I'm from the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan, where we are on Algonquin territory here. And back home for 25 years, it's been the Conservative incumbent Cheryl Gallant, who may be the front runner because it's pretty solid, but Liberal contender Cindy Mills has been, I guess, garnering a great deal of attention. So I'm watching that. But in terms of Indigenous representation, it's, we have a weird relationship, I guess, with electoral politics too. But for some of the Indigenous peoples, we're saying, well, do you want to pick your treaty partner in this too? So therefore, we see the NDP have, 15 or 16 individuals that are running under their banner, and then the Liberals just slightly less, and then about half that is Conservative, and I think 4 maybe the Green. But in terms of Indigenous, the North is fairly interesting too, because it's almost a de facto majority of being Inuit, unlike our regions in the South where we make up like a small proportion. But there are regions, like you say, Peter, you're right, you are the ones that can swing it, such as Northern Saskatchewan. So those are large proportions that can, where the margins are thin, might be enough in terms of numbers.
Speaking of the North, were you disappointed to see that there were no Indigenous candidates in Yukon?
I did not know that.
Isn't that surprising?
I thought, looking at the names, I thought for sure one of these is Indigenous. I'm disappointed to hear that. The Yukon, like any of the territories, is has a very large Indigenous population, very prominent, and so I'm very surprised by that.
And let's mention, oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there. NDP incumbent Lori Eaglet, she has some really tough competitions. What are your thoughts on her chances of re-election tonight?
Where was it?
Lori Eaglet in Winnipeg Centre.
Oh, I see. Okay.
She NDP incumbent, has been there very long. Nunavut, sorry.
Nunavut, yes.
Yeah, Nunavut, sorry.
Lori Idlutz, up in Nunavut, representing.
Oh, Lori Idlutz.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. She, again, it's a swing riding. You never really know. And Lori has done a very, very good public relations job during her tenure. She's made some to residents of the gun control, gun management, gun laws, etc. Very, very important to a hunting society, and she was not really outspoken on that. And the carbon tax was not a happy notion for Northerners, for whom cost of everything is much, much higher than any place else. And by association, taxes on anything are higher than any place else. And so the carbon tax was not popular. She voted for that. However, she's a strong contender in this one, but does have a very strong challenger, I believe, in the Liberal candidate. And again, I've noted that there were very early large turnouts for early voting up north, which is kind of unusual. And I think they also felt in the north that strategic voting is important, albeit it's a very, very small population. And the factors I mentioned earlier in a joking kind of way still matter.
Yeah.
And so I could not call it. So Lori does have challenges, that is for sure.
I was thinking Leah Gazan in Winnipeg Centre
yeah.
earlier. I was all over the place because she
yeah.
also has a very tight
right.
race coming her way. We have so much to tackle tonight. Before we send it over to Winnipeg, last thought.
Well, I was going to say the guns issue too. So
Yeah.
in my region of the world, it goes back to I think a social media post that Carey Price, the former goaltender for the Canadians, had posted, who was defensive of it. And I noticed on some social media posts too is that, well, hey, the Liberals lost me, and this was long ago too, when they brought in. I guess laws that regulated, I guess, the registration and the holding of guns because of the sustenance and hunting traditions for us. That if it's a single issue, it was enough to wedge in my region anyways too, but I've heard other people say it as well too. But I guess we'll see.
In the bigger picture.
We'll have to get to the bigger picture a little later on. We have so much to tackle throughout the evening, but it is time to hand it over to our team back in Winnipeg. There's so much to talk about, Creeson and Dennis. It is going to be a good night.
Right you are there, Kim. Hi, thank you so much. As we mentioned before, we have reporters standing by across the country. Let's go back to Ottawa, where our Savannah Craig is live at Liberal leader Mark Carney's headquarters at TD Place Arena in Ottawa's the Glebe neighborhood. Savannah, what's the mood like there? And from what we can see on the screen, it looks like the Liberals are in the lead right now.
So the mood is anticipation. We've been here for the last few hours, and it's mostly journalists in the room. There's a few international media outlets present, but the mood is also hope for a majority government. The Liberals need 172 seats for a majority government. The results, as we know, are coming in out east, and just now here in Ontario, in the rest of Eastern Canada and Central Canada, the polls are closing. So we may see a mood shift here soon, but just now speeches will be set to begin. I'm not quite sure who will be giving a speech or when we'll be hearing from Mark Carney. I spoke with a Liberal staffer who said that they could not confirm this information due to security reasons. But we may be seeing an energy shift as more results begin to come out, and I will check in with you later.
Thank you, Savannah. That's Savannah Craig reporting live from Ottawa. We'll catch up with you a little later on in the show.
And still in Ottawa, we're going to check now with our Fraser Needham, who is at Pierre Poilievre's headquarters, not far away at the Rogers Centre in downtown Ottawa near Parliament Hill. Fraser, what's the mood like over there right now?
Actually, it's just starting to fill up here. The polls just close at 9:30, right? So people are still coming in from campaigns and things like that. It's not, but as far as the atmosphere for the Conservatives, pretty happy, I guess. It was pensive, but they're certainly happy that they didn't get wiped out or doesn't appear they well in Atlantic Canada. They actually looks like they may have picked up 2 seats. They had 8 at dissolution. There's 32 and they have 10. Liberals have the rest. The other thing is the NDP vote is totally cratered. They didn't have any seats in Atlantic Canada at the beginning, but it's running around 2.3% or 2%, which is kind of showed quite down in the polls.
Thanks, Fraser. We'll catch up with you, of course, a little later on in the show. Back here in studio, Cassidy, checking in with the leaders' campaigns there, the Liberals and the Conservatives. Either of their 2 platforms, do you think, speak to Indigenous peoples more?
Just purely by mention would be the Liberal Party platform. There was 73 mentions of Indigenous. Of that, 19 were Métis. In the CPC, Conservative Party platform, it was 23. So a huge gap in mentions, and it is what it is. That's what I look for right away, is how many times are Indigenous peoples mentioned. Métis mentioned twice in the Conservative Party platform, so a lot less of that distinctions-based language. And I talk about that distinctions-based language because it's important. It's important for us to know. Do they know who we are? Do they know what our priorities are? Are they going to understand that, Indigenous peoples are rights holders, we're not stakeholders? And then the NDP was 18 mentions of Indigenous and 1 Métis. So
wow,
just numbers alone, it was the Liberal Party platform that had more mentions of Indigenous, and the priorities, I think, align with the work that we have been doing over the last 4 years at least, with a little glimpse into the future there. But the Liberals would lead that.
That is shocking to me that there was only that few mentions in the NDP there. Jen, heading over to you. One of our experts, you were here with us last week when we had Pam Palmater with us, and she said the Conservative platform, which was released just last week, was repackaged from the Harper era. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we've definitely seen some big changes in the Conservative Party of Canada platform over the years. I think there is a lot more focus on Indigenous issues than there traditionally used to be. But also, I think it's also about the monumental strides that you can make. Is we talk a lot about reconciliation, we talk a lot about the words and the language around us, but every single thing within a platform actually affects us at the end of the day. How a party approaches justice and crime affects us. How a government addresses things like mental health, addiction, those sorts of things affects us. Because when we're, the marginalized group in Canada, we're disproportionately affected by all of these things. So I do kind of look for that. And, the Conservative Party of Canada platform still has a long way to go. But I will say that I was surprised to see, some supports in different areas, like the support for language revitalization and Indigenous media. I was like, that's a little niche. But it's still missing on those bigger issues that we're talking about, because it's you can talk about all that flowery language around some of those smaller deliverables, but when you're missing things like consultation and consent, you're missing things like child welfare, it's okay, and even First Nations policing, it's I genuinely in 2025 don't know how our political parties are missing the mark on issues that First Nations people have been fighting in court over. How do you not even find some type of way to address those issues when we're sitting in court fighting you over them? So that's a little bit concerning there. But I will say, the Liberals have been good at talking about us a lot more than any other political party. And they've had some big monumental strides over their last 9 years in government, but I'm looking for action.
Nigan, do you think any of these party platforms really hit home for Indigenous peoples?
Well, I want to echo what I said before. Jennifer pointed out that I think it's worth noting that the Conservative Party, said one thing, like, for example, supporting Indigenous media in local areas. Like, that's a pretty outside the box for what the Conservative agenda tended to be for most of the campaign. The same week that they announced the platform, the final week of the campaign, saying, "Oh, we're going to support Indigenous language on media." Suddenly, it's kind of a weird, because then Pierre Poilievre comes out and says, "Well, we're going to get rid of wokeness." Which, of course, if you know wokeness is kind of this idea of marginalized people arguing for their rights from specific corners or areas or communities. I mean, so it's a little contradictory. I would say that the Liberal Party surprised me the most in their platform. And what I mean by that is they are offering a legal right, a human right to water. It's only a few years ago that Paul Martin, the finance minister for the Liberal Party under Jean Creeson, instituted the 2% cap on First Nations communities, which created emergency situations, which created the massive issues of water. Boil water advisories almost tripled during that time. And then after the Liberals have sort of created that problem over a long period of time, we now have a Liberal perhaps government that seems to be offering a platform in which Indigenous peoples have a human right to water. If we had had that previously, years ago, many of the boil water advisories we now know of would have never happened, because First Nations would have simply taken the federal government to court to say that we have a human right, and that would have been dealt with rather promptly. There's a whole bunch of other things within the Liberal Party platform that I think was impressive, but that particular one little section involving a legal right to water, it was really impactful to me, and said, well, there's something going on in the Liberal Party there's people getting to conversations, or perhaps evoking Bill C-15, that Indigenous rights are a part of a right to life, and that they bridge into areas like water.
Yeah, that Indigenous media announcement by the Conservatives, a bit of a head scratcher. We couldn't even get questions into them most of the time during the campaign here. Starting to see some of the numbers coming in. Liberals still out to a bit of a lead there. Cassidy, 7.3 million people voted in the advance polls. That's a record 25% increase from the 2021 federal election. What do you make of that?
Well, I was one of them. I voted early. I think there was just a lot of conversation about this election. Again, my opening remarks, I talked about that whirlwind of political activity that's kind of led up to this election, and it's happened so quick that it's hard not for it to be the top of your attention. And, it's not dragged on so long that people lose, they don't lose interest in this. So I think that had something to do with it. I also think largely, following the American election and Donald Trump being elected, we saw Kamala Harris leading for so long, and then of course Donald Trump won that election, and so much has happened. That's been the top of the media for the last few months, and everybody's paying attention, especially once it struck home. And talking about Canada as the 51st state, I think that people who might be a little bit more apathetic and not wanting to vote, that still catches people's attention. So I think a lot more interest in this election, and it's a good thing. It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Nigon, when Dennis was at Portage Place Mall today, there's a voting station there, and it was pretty busy. What kind of turnout are you expecting?
I think this will be one of the higher turnouts amongst Indigenous communities, with the highest elections that we've seen, or the most recent elections where we've eclipsed 61% in the 2015 election, 67%. That means 2 out of every 3 potential First Nations voters. It's very hard to keep track of, for instance, Métis voters. Also hard, a lot of not great infrastructure in the north to be able to keep track of Inuit voters. But we do have some fairly accurate on-reserve numbers. So 2019 saw 67%. That dropped slightly in the 2020 election. I think that you're going to see First Nations, Inuit, Métis voters come out en masse, as well as most Canadians. We're probably looking at a fairly high number. Typically, Canadian elections oscillate between 55% and 70%. You're probably going to see closer to the 70 number this time around, probably because, again, we've mentioned it several times, when you have an outside force like Donald Trump, who is tweeting out this morning, sending out messages saying, hey, vote for me to be president or prime minister or governor of Canada, or whatever he decides to call the leader of Canada this week. It is absolutely inspiring many Canadians to go out and vote. There are many people who are still in line right now. The polls closed just about 15 minutes ago, 14 minutes ago, but people are still in line right now waiting to vote. They have a right to do so. And for many polling booths, they're reporting record numbers, record turnouts, particularly on the prairies. And so what I'm hearing, and I must say that I have a family member who's working at a polling booth, they're very busy today. So busy, in fact, that they won't return their father's texts.
Jennifer, do you think everybody, well, I mean, Nigon's saying it, I saw it earlier today, pretty busy. Do you think, not everybody voted in those advance polls, many waiting to vote today?
I think, there is a way higher turnout for advanced polls. I think we broke a record, which is, very surprising, especially over Easter weekend. 2021 also showed a very high show out for advanced polls. But I also think, the momentum that I was talking about earlier with how we're modernizing politics now. So you're seeing all your friends, I think I was there bright and early first thing on Sunday, Easter Sunday morning to vote. And then you're going and you're telling all your friends, right? So it's right in everybody's faces where they're like, oh, I better go vote. And we're talking about how busy the polls are being, and we're like, go early. So it's kind of creating that momentum where I think everybody is starting now to bring back that concept of, oh, I should vote, and I feel pressured to vote now because everyone else is doing it, which you should vote, by the way. But I think we're going to start seeing this trend in further elections as well.
Cassidy, do you think Trump is what is driving Indigenous people to the polls, or what are the motivating factors here?
I think there's a lot. Trump perhaps might be driving Indigenous voters to the polls, especially when we talk about sovereignty of this country. You can't talk sovereignty in this country without talking to Indigenous people and talking about Indigenous sovereignty. Unfortunately, in the last few months since this has risen to the top of people's minds, it hasn't really been the top of conversation in mainstream media, talking about how Indigenous peoples are talking about sovereignty within the tariff wars, within this fight against Donald Trump's idea of the 51st state. So perhaps that is something, but I really do think that, the numbers are looking at the Indigenous candidates. That drives Indigenous voters up. I think the issues that have been started to talk about and then kind of, it stopped when Parliament got pro-road, like the clean drinking water bill, continuing to see what happens with C-92. Those issues that have started to gain huge momentum but are stopped because of this process, I think drives Indigenous voters to want to be more participants in this process.
Nigon, you wrote a bit about this, the Indigenous peoples and feeling patriotic, I guess, in these times right now with Trump. Do you think that Trump was a motivating factor for getting Indigenous peoples out to the polls?
Oh, absolutely. It was no question. But I would say that it wasn't the only issue, and I think Cassidy's right. There was lots of different things that motivate Indigenous voters. I think Jennifer did a great job articulating that inside ridings, there's many family dynamics, community dynamics, cultural dynamics. For instance, historical mistrust is real, and I think that for many Indigenous peoples, there is a great deal of apathy. Why would you participate? I think one of the large proponents of concerns around participation comes from a lot of sectors, particularly out in the East, who have had some very negative experiences with historical Canadian governments that have invaded their territories. The Mohawks come to mind as just an example. But I think many of us, especially Anishinaabe people, we feel sort of a vexed feeling about voting. And when we do vote, we're looking at issues like, for example, cows and plows, the settlements that involve historical treaty rights is another example. But I also think that the ways in which the Liberal Party particularly, and then of course the long-standing relationship the NDP has with First Nations and Métis communities, they matter. The fact that the Liberal Party reduced a great deal of boil water advisories, I see that carrying a great deal of weight. Let's say, for example, Shoal Lake 40. I also see a huge amount of upswing in support for First Nations communities in for the Liberals in Manitoba. But I also see some very staunch support for people like Leah Gazan in Winnipeg Centre, because, strong Indigenous woman fighting for issues of murder, missing Indigenous women and girls, and the inquiry and the calls for justice. So, I would say that for many Indigenous peoples, there's a whole host of factors. Donald Trump is not the only one, but it is remarkable when the First Nations Premier, the very first First Nations Premier of a Canadian province, is standing in front of the Manitoba legislature with a massive Canadian flag, being for the most part Captain Canada, and right along Doug Ford as being the kind of main staunch advocates for this country, and then announcing bans on alcohol. There were so many interesting scenes during this campaign that I think are unprecedented and remarkable. I wrote about them a few times, but there's many of them from coast to coast to coast, all the ways in which Indigenous people sort of navigated this election. And I think that one other thing that was very interesting is, no Indigenous candidates in the Yukon, as our other panel were speaking about that in Ottawa. There's also some interesting historical tendencies that perhaps we need to look at as well.
Really quickly, Jennifer, we got about probably 30 seconds left, but what do you say to the people who have come out today and throughout in the weeks past saying, I'm sovereign, I'm Indigenous, we shouldn't participate in federal politics because we're sovereign? What do you say to them really quickly here?
That's a part of self-determination, and if you decide you don't want to vote, that's completely up to you. And if you decide you do want to vote, we deserve to take up space and we have the right to. So.
Well, thanks everyone for that great analysis. We'll head back to Ottawa and check in with Kim Sullivan and her guests as we continue to wait for tonight's election results. Kim?
Thanks, Creeson. Tallies rolling in. The polls are closing across the country, and we are back here in Ottawa discussing, just like you are behind the scenes here. We were talking about, of course, Arctic sovereignty. We were saying, Peter, while the Green Party takes, they're talking about departing from diesel and food security. The NTP, that's what's at the top of their promises. But the Liberal and the Conservatives are mostly focus on Arctic defense. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm glad they are, because it's often a forgotten topic amongst candidates when they run for Nunavut, as you say, food insecurity, housing, crisis. But in the bigger picture, since World War II, the North has been becoming more and more important to not only to Canada, but to countries around the world. And to begin with, in 1953, Canadian government moved people from northern Quebec, Nunavik, up to Resolute Bay and Grise Fiord, Agecoutay and Kausuituk. And in the name of sovereignty, in the name of Arctic sovereignty. And the reasons for that are not often laid out, but they are because there's so much wealth up there. They're not agricultural, by the way, but non-renewable resources are immense.
Absolutely.
And untapped, basically. There's renewable resources, and very importantly, is strategic militarily in a geopolitical sense. And nowadays, we hear challenges or noise from China, from Italy, even
Russia,
England,
Denmark, maybe.
Everywhere. The United States. The President of the United States recently making noise about Greenland, and then the 51st state rhetoric, all of which has to do in some way with the Arctic and the situation between Russia, the major powers. We're in a détente situation right now, I think, but that can erupt at any time. And
do you think it played a role in how people are voting specifically?
Well, I've been quite surprised in the last couple of weeks when people were asked on the street up north, no, food is more important to me. Housing is more important, and it is, because it's there. You're touched by these issues day in, day out. Sovereignty of the Arctic is something far away for people like he to talk about, because they're learned and so on and worldly. But I've been surprised that it's been a low-key topic in the election. It's the things that are more close at home that have been of importance to them.
I'm very surprised though, because when you think about climate change is affecting the North more than anywhere else, and the military are the firefighters, the rescuers, the land guardians, so having more military up north, it would be a good thing.
Well, yes, it is affecting the North in a visible way more than other areas. It's affecting the whole world. We're killing the oceans. The way we live as humans is not really sustainable. Ideologically, I don't know which capitalism or is more to blame, but industry is to blame, whatever the cause may be. But the North. Inuit see firsthand the effects of climate change. They admitted it. You will hardly find anyone in Nunavut who is a denier of climate change. They see it firsthand out on the land, affecting the animals. We see robins and bees and so forth.
So you think they'd want to have the military there if they're the protectors in a way of...
We've had military up there for some time, beginning with after the Second World War, the Distant Early Warning Line, or the DEW line as it was called, these massive arrays of radar cups pointing over the North, because the fear during the Cold War period was that the Red Hordes would come over the North Pole and boom, North America. So that military was there. Interaction between Inuit, local Inuit, and they began around that time in force. But there needs to be more of a Canadian presence. There is no doubt of that, with the threats, if you want to call them threats, coming from elsewhere around the world for possession of the Arctic. Lancaster Sound and the Northwest Passage is challenged by other nations as being non-Canadian, and yet we say it's Canadian. That's something that hasn't been settled yet internationally or by law of the sea, and we need to do that.
Veldon, do you think that any of these parties are actually going to keep these promises and these concerns at hand when it comes to the Arctic?
Yeah, well, we hear firsthand from the Inuit who live up there and who occupy the place, and we can look back in the last 10 years is that there were some nice gestures too from this Liberal government who apologized for what was an atrocious policy too. It was the relocation of Southern Inuit. Is like, you have to understand how large the Inuit Nunavut, like your homeland is. It is monstrous, and the strategic value of the North in the Cold War era was they took Inuit from the South who can be accustomed for 50,000 years to a much different locale, move them up north to devastating consequences for their families and communities. But now reflecting upon it here, so the symbolics of apologies for the great harm that they've done is the two dominant, I guess, leading parties right now are promising large investments in infrastructure for military. And it can bolster the economy on the one hand, but I think we hear quite rightly is that the shipping lanes too is climate change is opening up the passageway, which we see China and Russia, who even during the Harper Conservatives planted that little tiny flag is as an insult to sovereignty as well. And just to get back to Peter's point for the relocation was they used Inuit as what they called human flagpoles, is to put them up there to say we have a human presence, even though they treated them as subhuman, to say like, our people are up there, therefore that is our sovereign area. Now, if I listen to my colleagues, and I'm not an international relations expert by any means, is that they tell us is like it's one of the most geopolitically strategic geographical regions of the world that is going to be challenged by the superpowers. And with our neighbor to the south, and thinking of it, everything in this election, is it's changed the landscape of alliances. Is that we have someone who says, well, the Suez Canal in the south is going to be ours, and we're also going to take the north as well too. We border with Alaska, so all these international legal principles that are taken up in like where do borders, especially under the water ends where the continental cleavages and shelves meet, and because there's also Arctic oil, which
gold,
diamond. Uranium, gas.
So do we think Poilievre or Carney are I guess, powerful enough to actually make a difference up there.
Well, I think they might be, but just to go back to where the parties were, and I'll turn it over to Peter, was, just earlier in the year too, was like the off-the-cuff remark that was a bit insulting to Inuit, is that when Justin Trudeau was still Liberal leader, made the comment that they would introduce an Arctic ambassador, and to which Pierre Poilievre said, well, to who? To Santa Claus?
Ho, ho, ho.
Which ignores the massive presence
Absolutely.
and concentration of a very homogeneous population. As I mentioned earlier, it is almost a de facto Inuit majoritarian population up there that is like, well, wait a sec. At one point you treated us as human flagpoles, and now you forget that we're actually here too. So which leads us to questions about what was our place in this election and in the platforms too. But
if anything, a little sidebar history note here. When people in 1953 were moved up to claim sovereignty on behalf of Canada, and these were Inuit, it wasn't until 1960 when the John Diefenbaker government repealed parts of the Dominion Act of Canada so that Inuit and other First Peoples of North America could participate legally in political processes in Canada. My parents did not have the right or the legal right to vote until I was 10 years old in 1960. And yet these people who they moved up north did not have the right to vote in Canada. On the other issue, the major issue of how important is the Arctic, it is so important. I can't understate it, particularly these days, for geopolitical reasons, for strategic reasons, globally. And I think if I could impress upon whoever comes from the Yukon, from the Northwest Territories, from Nunavut, from Nunatsiavut, from Nunavik, that they have a good deal of leverage in the House of Commons. If they could get together with other Indigenous people who are in the House of Commons as members of Parliament, form an association, cross over party lines. When did we become so partisan anyway?
Yeah.
These parties were made by other people, not by us. We played like it was a sports thing,
You should get back into politics actively. I have to ask, though, how well have the Conservatives engaged our First Nations and the Inuit during this campaign?
Well, on comment about Arctic diplomacy and Arctic ambassadorship, well, Pierre Poilievre, sir, you are so very wrong. It is more needed now than it ever was. In fact, we can define the terms of reference for an ambassador from Canada on Arctic matters yesterday. It should, we need it now. And I don't understand why anybody, especially someone of Mr. Poilievre's stature, to say something like, to whom, Santa Claus? Well, it's not a joke. It is real. Yeah. And today's politics, geopolitics, say that it's a concern that we should all be aware of as Canadians.
Carney was very adamant about saying never imposing when it comes to the development of resources, especially in the French debate. We just spoke about all the resources that are up north with, let's say, a Liberal Party that does come in and wins. Do you think that never imposing, that universal, uniform consent will actually hold to the development of all that preciousness that's up north?
Well, I'll just draw upon an op-ed that was published in the Toronto Star earlier this month by, our Algonquin, one of our two Algonquin Grand Chiefs, Savannah McGregor, and she pointed to the words that Pierre Poilievre used is like, these will be pre-approved projects. So the major infrastructure that will go through the natural resources. So just using that and the constitutional status of Indigenous peoples in Canada is that it actually runs up against a lot of the law, and it makes things much more difficult where it's going to be pre-approved and overriding the duty to consult and accommodate, especially with Supreme Court decisions like Rio Tinto and what have you, is that there's cumulative effects. But even up in the north, it was, I remember just less than 10 years ago down the street here on the front lawn of the Supreme Court of Canada watching the decision of Clyde Hamlet. it was sort of very much David versus Goliath, a small Inuit hamlet that took on the federal government for the Clyde River, for the government just trying to plow through, or at least undertake exploratory measures that affected Inuits' inherent rights.
You mentioned constitutional status. Another little sidebar story here. Pierre Poilievre had made some noise about using the notwithstanding clause on matters within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. Well, Section 35, which recognizes First Nations, Inuit and Métis, is outside of the Charter, and the reason for that was to make some history short, it was. I happen to have made that motion in a special joint House of Commons and Senate committee in January of 1981, chaired by Serge Roy, all parties, both Senate and House of Commons. And that motion, while it was attacked by the Alberta and Saskatchewan premiers and taken off, was reinstated, eventually morphed into Section 35. And the reason it's out of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is that the notwithstanding clause cannot touch it.
There you have it. This is a perfect moment to stop this segment. Conclusion of this segment as we send it over to Winnipeg is that it's going to be very interesting to see how the North actually does vote. And those numbers are coming in. So we're going to send it back to you now, Dennis and Creeson.
Thank you, Kim. We go now to Jagmeet Singh's HQ in the Burnaby South riding in Vancouver. That's where our Tina House is live from. Tina, can you tell us what's going on there? So far, what we're seeing, the NDP have only secured 3 seats.
Well, it's pretty quiet around here right now. I mean, we're just expecting more people to be rolling in very shortly. As you know, the polls just closed here in BC, so it is going to be an interesting evening, so we'll just see how it unfolds.
And Tina, what has been the reaction from people in the room? What have NDP people been telling you about tonight, and what they're seeing, what they're hoping for in this election night?
Well, obviously this election is incredibly crucial. As we know, Jagmeet Singh has been the leader of the political party here across the country since 2017 and the MP since 2019 to 2025. So this Burnaby South riding is very crucial to the election. It's actually a trigger point, if you ask me, to see what happens for the NDP across the country.
And Tina, judging on the polls previously, there was talks throughout this election campaign that the NDP could lose party status if they don't have enough seats to secure party status. And even there's talks that Jagmeet Singh could lose his seat as being a leader of the NDP. What are your thoughts about that, or what are you hearing from people there?
Yeah, that's been the talk that I've heard as well. I mean, it's a real thing. It could be a reality here for the NDP. So it's just a matter of time. Today we actually drove around looking for signs for the NDP and support in the community. Unfortunately, we didn't see an awful lot. So if that tells you anything, that could show later in the numbers as they come out.
Thank you, Tina. That's Tina House in the Burnaby South riding in Vancouver. Jagmeet Singh's HQ there. We'll come back and check with you a little later in the show. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks so much. See you again soon.
Gonna head out to the East Coast now, where Angel Moore is in the Cape Breton-Canso Antigonish riding. Recently made the trek. She was down in New York City covering the gathering down there at the United Nations, all the way to Benyon, Unama'ki, which is Mi'kmaq for Cape Breton. Angel, what's the mood out there?
There's excitement in the room as the countdown begins, where supporters are here with Liberal candidate Jaime Baptiste at the Lakes at Benyon Golf and Country Club Resort, located in Unama'ki, Mi'kmaq for Cape Breton. This is expected to be a tight race. The Conservative candidate is Alan McMaster, a well-known politician since 2009. He was the provincial deputy minister and minister of finance in 2021. Last fall, McMaster stepped down to seek the federal nomination. This is Baptiste's third federal election. Baptiste was elected in 2019 and re-elected in 2021 to represent the Sydney-Victoria riding. But this election, Baptiste is running in a new riding called Cape Breton, Canso, and Tigonish, which includes 5 Mi'kmaq nations, including Baptiste's home, Eskizoni First Nation. The other communities are Bolidek, Wegmacook, and Yagogama, all located in Unamagi, and Buckingay, which is located in mainland Nova Scotia. I'll be back later tonight with the final results. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Unamagi.
Thanks, Angel. Last I saw, just check it again there, but last I saw, it looked like Jaime Batiste was going to probably win that riding. But let's go back to what Tina was talking about there, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh looking at 3 seats there right now. Cassidy, previous polls suggested the NDP could lose party status, and in doing so, of course, talked that Jagmeet Singh would also step down. They had 24 seats prior to this, need 12 seats to hang on to party status. I guess your thoughts on the campaign that the NDP and Jagmeet Singh ran here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You could see that Jagmeet Singh was really focused on defending healthcare, pharmacare, the dental bill that they were able to pass. It's interesting to see them lose so much support. You know, they had a significant role to play in this last government with the supply and confidence agreement. They were able to get, I would say, more done as NDP than the NDP federally has done in a long time because of that agreement with the Liberals. But I think a lot of people were unhappy with it. But again, you know, you saw Jagmeet Singh really trying to defend those pieces and make sure that, you know, if the Conservatives get elected, that those pieces aren't going to be walked back, that pharmacare is not going to be walked back, that dental care is not going to be walked back. So he really focused on that, and I guess maybe just not enough on what's going to happen in the future for them.
Jennifer, what do you think Jagmeet Singh and the NDP needed to get their numbers up, or do you think this is already a losing battle?
Already a technical difficulty. I think one of the issues with Jagmeet Singh is that he's been quite unpopular in a lot of areas, and I think it has to do a lot with his alignment with Justin Trudeau, who is also becoming deeply, deeply unpopular. So he was wearing a lot of that. So when the Liberals, you know, got rid of Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney came in, you could see that there was no alignment there. Like Mark Carney was not hitching himself to that wagon. And there's also that really big component that a lot of people forget about is that in Canada, we have a very, very big piece of strategic voting. We have people that vote based off of wanting to keep other people from getting elected. We have people that will vote strategically to keep, you know, certain political parties out of power. And that became more prevalent in this election. And I think, you know, the Liberal Party and the NDP have a lot of accessible voters that will float from one party to another if they need to. So you need to be a party that can show that you are strong, that you're able to lead, and that you deserve to keep that vote. Because if the NDP supporters, for whatever reason, are upset with you or don't want to vote for you, or they're thinking of that strategic piece, they will move over to the Liberals.
Nigan, your thoughts on the campaign that Jagmeet Singh ran and, back down to 2 leading or elected at the moment right now. Your thoughts on where the NDP are at?
Yeah, 2 big stories happening right now before our very eyes. I don't know if you can see, but I keep sort of peeking over and looking at the election results just over top of my laptop, just over on the TV screen over there. In Manitoba, Churchill, Kiewit-Nagoski or Kiewit-Nuk, looks like Nikki Ashton has fallen fairly significantly behind, a few dozen votes, but the lead is stretching for Rebecca Chartrand, and it looks like Leah Gazan, who has been an incredible force within the party, and in many ways has come to loggerheads with Jagmeet Singh over the past few years. It looks like she is in a bit of trouble. Expectedly, it's going to be a tight fight throughout for the next series of polls that come in numbers. The reality is this, Jagmeet Singh is the most successful NDP leader ever for the NDP, or certainly in recent memory, because Jagmeet Singh got major hurdles done for the party: pharmacare, $10 a day childcare. All the things that he said during the election campaign is true. He not only sort of fell on the sword by not following the government last summer, saying that he didn't want Pierre Poilievre to gain government. I mean, in many ways, Jagmeet Singh has brought us to this moment. If the NDP withdraws their support last summer from the Liberals, we go into an early election before Donald Trump. Pierre Poilievre absolutely soars to a victory, a majority government likely. Lots of people can be very thankful for that, but the reward for being one of the most successful NDP leaders by affiliating with the Liberals is that he's going to have his career ended tonight. The NDP is in a monumental battle just for party status. We heard Veldon speak about that on the other panel out in Ottawa. That will mean a gutting of the NDP, no support for them financially within Ottawa. That means a whole heap of lack of access to research, being able to forward their agenda forward. Even bills will be almost impossible. Never mind the fact that who will be left? Maybe a handful of NDP MPs. We have yet to hear from BC. That's a huge pocket of NDP incumbents. And so we'll wait to see what happens in BC, whether they reach party status tonight, but that's the story to watch. And if Jagmeet Singh, regardless of the good things that he's done, the successful things that he's done, leads the party to one of its worst showings, almost to oblivion, he has no choice but to resign.
Cassidy, we talked about this last summer and again in the fall, but longtime Northern Ontario NDP MP Charlie Angus is stepping away from politics after more than 20 years on Parliament Hill. What does this loss mean to the Indigenous community there?
Yeah, Charlie Angus has played a significant role as a critic of, the Crown Indigenous Relations file. And I mean, first of all, if the NDP only have 5 seats, then they're not going to have a critic. They're not going to have enough people to criticize all the files anyways. But that critic role plays a significant role within Parliament. When I was president of Métis National Council, you want to have meetings with all of the critics that are key to your file. So having those meetings with Charlie Angus was critical to making sure that everything that we wanted to see moving forward was on track. If we had questions and we wanted those questions raised, you go to those critics. And so Charlie Angus, it's a significant loss. And I know that he's got a new pathway forward for the work that he's doing as an advocate, and he's off to the races with what he's doing already.
Jennifer, Nigan's mentioning, that Jagmeet Singh probably have to step down here tonight if these numbers hold up. It's still got all the BC to come, but do you think we might see the end of his political career here as the federal leader of the NDP?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think he'll have much of a choice, especially if he loses his seat. But I think the NDP are going through an identity crisis. I think they need to rebuild, and they need to rebuild quickly. It's not good for anybody, kind of what we're seeing play out. I know there's a lot of people that are fans of Conservatives or might not be fans of Liberals, but a party governing for this long also isn't a good thing, especially when we are coming off of 9 years of hearing about some really big issues. We heard about ethics violations happening. We've heard about scandals left, right, and center. And it was almost becoming like people are getting a little bit desensitized because it's like, well, it's better than dealing with the other guy. And we did see some bigger issues in that time in government. Jody Wilson-Raybould and what happened there. SNC-Lavalin should have sunk that government, and it didn't. And now we're heading into, potentially another term of another Liberal government. The NDP's been essentially gutted. The Conservatives are going to be kind of spinning tires on what they've been doing for the last, 9 years. So I'm a little bit concerned about the state of government, to be honest with you.
Nigan, you mentioned this a little bit, but can you explain some of the things the NDP can be proud of during these past years and what they got accomplished during this past minority government?
The NDP government, led by Jagmeet Singh, brought forth agendas that were highly progressive. So progressive, in fact, that I would say that Justin Trudeau co-opted much of the NDP party platform for much of his time in office. All the things that you saw back in 2015 when Justin Trudeau swept to power with a majority, defeating Stephen Harper, he moved the party, the Liberal Party, particularly to a left-center position. And all those things, childcare, $10 a day childcare, pharmacare, forwarding lots of different issues involving Indigenous rights. And there you don't see for instance, residential schools be recognized as genocide without, of course, Pope Francis recognizing it. But then, of course, the NDP being right there lockstep with the Liberals, making sure that there is a kind of a conscience within the Liberal Party to consider, to bring forth, to include Indigenous rights. There's a reason why, and just to, I don't want to take any of Cassidy's thunder, but I would just say that the Manitoba Métis Federation has been very, very close with the Liberal Party. And in many ways, within the broader scope of Métis, the Métis National Council, they've had very close ties with the NDP. And so there's lots of different ways in which the Liberals and the NDP have really taken some of that left position. And if I could just add for just a minute, you will see that shift under Mark Carney. Mark Carney will bring that party more to a centrist position. And so some of that identity crisis that the NDP is dealing with, Jennifer spoke about just a minute ago, there is space for the NDP to rebuild here, but it's going to need a fresh face right at the center. The question is who is that person? There really isn't anyone that has the kind of public profile. We think back to what Jagmeet Singh brought to the table. The reason that he became federal leader was because of that confrontation that he took with a rather racist heckler many, many years ago, where he showed a reasonable course of debate, showed a really cool hand, a cool mind. There really isn't someone within the NDP ranks, and if there was, it might have been like Leah Gazan as an example, but Leah Gazan's in trouble tonight, and Nikki Ashton is certainly in trouble, former person who ran for the leadership. Who is that Liberal face on the horizon? I can't tell you who it is. I don't know.
Yeah, we're going to do a round of that a little later, I think, because I don't think any of us have any idea who that face might be. But as you can see there, the numbers starting to get away. It's looking like the Liberals will form the next government. Whether that's going to be a majority or a minority is yet to be seen. But I believe we're going to go back to Ottawa, where our Savannah Craig is at Mark Carney headquarters. Savannah, what's the mood over there now?
The mood has definitely changed, Dennis. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of cheering. We've seen 3 outlets have called that the Liberals will form a minority government, and each time we hear an update here, there's lots of cheering from the crowd. We're seeing that Poilievre is not too far behind, so we'll have to wait and see if the Liberals will be forming just a minority or a majority government. But the mood here is very energetic, and a lot of people seem very happy here at the Liberal headquarters.
Savannah, any word when Mark Carney will get on stage and give a speech?
No word. I have been trying to find out. As I said earlier, I spoke with a Liberal staffer who said that they could not confirm this information due to security reasons. But I'm hoping to find out more information, and we can update you all and share some words when Carney goes up on stage.
Thanks, Savannah. We'll be coming back to you, no doubt. I guess maybe let's get everybody's thoughts here, though, on this Liberal government that's going to be formed. Maybe, Jennifer, we'll start with you. Maybe not that big of a surprise. Don't know how big of a win it's going to be, but your thoughts on the Liberals forming another mandate here for them.
Yeah, the reality is the reality. I genuinely, a little bit of a hot take, I don't think they deserve it. I think, it was time to see a new government come in. Whether or not people agree with that is completely up to them. But it comes into that little bit of concerning around how long they've been sitting there, and if Mark Carney has the ability to completely flip the party and to make, new strides and to get them all, in a position where they feel like they actually need to follow the rules, I'll be a lot happier. But tighten up the bureaucracy a little bit, the spending, and there's some really big conversations that we need to have. My family group chat is popping off right now. My family's talking about crime. They're talking about some of the issues that we're seeing on the ground, and it is concerning because we have seen some of those issues get worse throughout the last, several years. And, people say, well, you need to blame your province, but we've been under the same Sask Party government in Saskatchewan since 2008. So it's really difficult for people just to blame the provincial government when we are seeing direct, results out of our federal government here in Saskatchewan as well.
Cassidy, your take on the current election results here and the Liberals in the lead.
Yeah, so I kind of both agree and disagree with Jennifer on that statement there. You know, when we had Trudeau as our prime minister, I too was thinking, okay, it's time for a new government. You know, it's getting a little dull, things are getting a little rocky. We're not making progress. The talk about reconciliation is just talk at this point. We're not making the instrumental change that needs to happen for Indigenous peoples in this country. I was totally on that page. Time for a new government. But where I disagree is that, you know, with Mark Carney as the leader of the Liberal Party, it's going to be a new government. If the Liberals are elected, you know, again, we've yet to see if it's going to be a minority or a majority. That's also going to change things. But with Mark Carney at the helm, it's going to be totally different. There's going to be new staffers. It's going to be a new government, and hopefully a little bit of a refresh of the Liberal Party, and can kind of pull up their socks and get to work on some of the promises that they've made.
Poor BC here. Polls haven't even closed out there, and this thing looks to be over. Nigan, your thoughts on another Liberal government?
I apologize. I was on mute because you know, it's so interesting. Like, it's like minute by minute results. It is absolutely certain there is going to be a Liberal government. The question is majority, minority. What it tells you, though, is there is the beginning of what it was predicted to be a Liberal wave, but it didn't start in the Maritimes. Didn't start until Quebec. And what you saw is an absolute gutting, overtaking of many seats that were longtime Bloc Quebecois seats. You're seeing like, when would you see a Quebec province go Liberal in the ways in which, like, even this isn't even the kind of stuff that Jean Chrétien was able to achieve back in the years in which he had supermajorities across the country. And so going through the 905 in Ontario, you're seeing many ridings go Liberal that were just months ago guaranteed Conservative seats. There's a reason, I think, that Pierre Poilievre, in many ways, in the final day of the campaign, just abandoned the 905 and then went off to save some of the major ridings in Saskatchewan and Calgary. It wasn't just about trying to show big rallies, but it was the fact that there was some ridings out there where he had to shore those up. And we're going to see probably the very first Liberal riding in Saskatchewan for the first time in almost a decade. As we've been talking all night tonight, the Destinée Missinippi Churchill River, the riding is looking like it is bending towards the Liberals, Buckley Boulanger. And we're also seeing Rebecca Chartrand in the north of Manitoba. It looks like that red wave is sweeping across, and First Nations, Inuit and particularly Métis voters are very much being caught up in looking at a Carney government. And the question is how strong will it be to face off against Donald Trump? And if they are in minority status, will they need those few NDP votes? They're about half a dozen right now. Will they need those to push them over the edge?
Thank you, Nigan, Jennifer, and Cassidy. We're now going to throw it over to our host, Kim Sullivan, back in Ottawa.
Thanks, Creeson and Dennis. Wow, we have the results coming in, and it's quite exciting. We're following, as Nigan Sinclair just said, minute by minute by minute. We're about less than 30 votes away from a Liberal majority. That's what you were. Yeah. That's what you were projecting.
Yeah. So at this point, I think I might hazard a guess that it would be, just in my own opinion, perhaps a threadbare sort of majority, just above the 172 seat threshold. I don't know, Peter.
An opinion?
Yeah. On that, I do not have an opinion.
Surprised?
I am
so
surprised.
Yes.
For some reason, the last few days, I had been starting to think that a Trump-like win could happen here in Canada, considering that Pierre Poilievre and his party have been closing the gap, and could they actually reach the point where they could overtake the Liberals in a minority situation, perhaps? But I'm a little bit pleasantly surprised, I think, because I feel safer, frankly.
I was going to say, you mentioned the first time we went to air that a lot of people may be voting by fear or by security, or
right from wrong.
Right from wrong. So many people are probably feeling just like you, safer right now, that this is the way it's playing?
Well, this election has been different. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. It's unprecedented in some ways that we've never seen in Canada, and the turnout is indicative of that. And you can speak to that much better than I can. The results are probably indicative of that. And also, I noted during the pandemic, remember the pandemic?
We all remember the pandemic.
Well, true colors of people started to come out. They started to manifest themselves in ways that wasn't always pleasant to see, and south of the border and here in Canada. And I think that's probably being reflected a little bit in this election, which is why as I said earlier, I kind of feared that may catch up and that may overtake. Now, I'm not taking sides. I want to comment on partisanship. Indigenous MPs and senators and where they ought to stand in the House of Congress. This is something I've thought about over the years a lot, but I am pleasantly surprised that it probably will be a Liberal minority, and I think the vote, as you mentioned earlier, offside. The vote in Inuit land, Nunavut specifically, seemed to be swinging towards a Liberal win, and that's probably a strategic vote for a change, and rather than Lori had done nothing wrong. And she's a pleasant person. She's accessible. She's gone to all of the communities, which is a big plus if you're a politician or MP up there. People like to shake hands with whoever is around, and so that indicates to me that it probably may have had to do with Mr. Carney himself and with strategic voting not being manifested across the country.
I like that you used the word change, because it is somewhat of a change. As they were mentioning in Winnipeg, it's a refresh. It is the Liberal Party, but it's a new Liberal Party. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, looking back on governments where they've changed leader, I guess at towards the end of where you kind of have the sort of voter fatigue within the incumbent. So incumbent fatigue, as it might have been, you can go back to when Kim Campbell took over for shortly. Shortly. Although there was a large spike in the polls because the Mulroney government and Prime Minister Mulroney was deeply unfavorable at that particular point. But over that summer and into the fall, where they had the election where Jean Chrétien Liberals came in and reduced the then Progressive Conservatives to 2 seats, and Kim Campbell didn't even win again. And then you look again to the tail end where Jean Chrétien served 9, almost 10 years, and then Paul Martin takes over and he gets minority, and then it's a very short-lived prime ministership, as it might be. What would it be for Carney is that there was like I guess unprecedented renewal in it, and refreshed. Is a different person, but also I think because of the geopolitical situation with and the favorability that we saw, there's a congenial personality too that was different from the sort of attack dog that we had seen for the last year or so. All we heard from Pierre Poilievre was calling people wacko, and he was aggressive. And if you look at some of the numbers from the polling, he had a considerably less support from women, and 50% of voters are women. And unfortunately, he didn't garner enough support from them, and that could have lost it because he was just not as likable as Carney is.
It's interesting that you say that, because our HQ Winnipeg was talking a lot about the NDP and big loss on their end today. If we look at Jagmeet Singh, he was very likable. People really liked him, but he had a couple rough and tough where he wanted to showcase that tougher side of him, and that didn't work for him. So
no, but I think Peter's analysis is quite right, is that those voters on that side might have retreated towards the center when faced with what we might say is this once in our lifetime existential threat on the political landscape. And the shifting tide is that who could we fend off against what is the perceived threat is the cousin party to the threat in the South in the United States, as we're all talking about. We haven't mentioned it yet, so
it's almost
perceived perhaps, but it's existential.
It's existential. Like
it's like I like him, but can he protect me?
Exactly.
In a sense.
And I think Pierre Poilievre dropped the ball because he didn't come out of the gates, because you could also see a little bit of the bump in the polls with Justin Trudeau, even after he said, I'm resigning and there will be a leadership convention, is that him facing off in his last 2 or 3 weeks against Trump, and people were, oh my goodness, we could have had this like 2 or 3 years ago, but he was handing off the reins anyways, and Carney came out of the gate and took a strong stance against that, whereas Poilievre was sort of nowhere to be found up until the sort of milquetoast is one statement he made during the campaign was like, I would tell President Trump to knock it off. And it was just like, and I mean, we laugh at it because it's almost comical, because it is something that you would read out of a comic almost, whereas we have somebody who's seasoned in international affairs and serving, and also, as we've said, unprecedented, serving as the central banker for two of the largest central banks, which nobody does ever. And
when you think about it, it comes down to money. People need more money to buy food, more money to access housing, more money so to have somebody who has, been able to direct these banks and to work with money efficiently, it's comforting to know that he may be running the money of the country, but will he be able to is an interesting.
An economist versus a sloganist.
Yeah.
And I think it's no contest if it's for real. One reason that the middle ground, the NDP and so forth, are losing ground, I think, and we'll see at the end of the night whether that's true or not, is because this time around it's a vote of necessity. It's not really a vote of ideology as we usually see. My heart, I was elected twice as an NDPer.
Yes.
And so to leave them because in trade for a process to divide or partition the Northwest Territories so that Nunavut could happen was a very, very difficult decision for me. And it saddens me to see the NDP losing ground here, but I think it's probably because people are afraid of what's happening down south. One good thing about all of that is that we are now seeing how Canadians are.
Yes.
And here's something a friend of mine, the late Josie Kusurak, said a long time ago: first Canadians, Canadian first. And lovely saying. Perhaps we should all be saying that in Canada now. To get away from that smarmy kind of...
I like it.
Is it true that it's as much a vote against Trump as it is between parties? An economist who has been seen to be able to deal with Trump in a way that silenced Trump for a couple of weeks before the whole idea of the 51st state came up again, and only lately has Pierre Poilievre in the last couple of days been loud about fending off Mr. Trump, but for a while he was pretty silent on the matter.
My question, though, is as we're seeing, the NDP losing a bit of power, the Bloc taking some good numbers there before we went, we might be voting, as you said, right now because we are fighting off something down south. But at what expense? What are we losing? What Indigenous issues are we losing by losing some of that NDP power, let's say?
Well,
please.
Moment, s'il vous plaît.
Absolutely.
I'm reminded of the very, very first time I ever walked into a caucus. It was an NDP caucus. It was in 1979. And when I walked into the room, the late Ian Waddell, who was an MP from British Columbia, saw me. Oh, Peter, welcome to the NDP. I'm so glad you're going to be working for the NDP. The venerable Stanley Knowles was standing nearby, immediately retorted to Mr. Waddell, He's not here for the party. He's here for his people. And I think that's how Indigenous people on the Hill should work. They're there for their people. Secondarily, they're there for the party that they're working in. But let it be known that my people first. I'm with you. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. But if necessary, you know, my people will come first if it's between you and my people.
Yeah. Closing remarks for this segment?
I think some of the gains, and I don't think I think it's probably been mentioned too, like for the other panelists out in Winnipeg, that much of the gains too, and it's been propped up in the NDP's deal to ensure that there were certain gains that benefit Indigenous peoples because we're so far behind, and there is the socioeconomic gap. So a lot of social programming that might be lost too, whereas like the focus will shift on international affairs and geopolitics, and it'll, you know, the cupboard might be a little bit bare in terms of the matters that the NDP had always brought to Indigenous peoples for a while, but it's our survival at stake.
Support, the NDP was strong at supporting community-driven health initiatives, especially. So are we scared that some of those may be disappearing in the next?
Well, Tommy Douglas came up with the idea of Medicare and universal Medicare, which is something we have in Canada, very proud of, which they don't have in the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. And if Indigenous candidates lose ground here, become fewer, I would suggest to them that get together.
Yes.
And, you know, if you're losing ground because the NDP is losing ground, then get together, form your own little, remain true to your parties that you're with, but form your own group and influence the government side as much as possible for whatever you feel your constituencies need. And in the North, it's immense. I think, and I'm not saying this because I'm from the North, I'm saying this because I think it's reality, statistically, geopolitically, the needs of the North. It's a fraction of the GMP of Canada that Canada pays to the North for housing, food, etc. Increase, those people are the stewards of the environment, of the national identity with the Arctic. Give them a better life. They need better education. They need all of this stuff. So, but as well in BC, in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, in the Atlantic provinces, these MPs who are of Indigenous descent should have influence.
They are our voices.
Yes,
they are our
your
voices. It'll be interesting to see in 2021, 11 MPs elected. It'll be interesting to see how many elected after tonight. We have to cut it short now. Our own Freezer Needham is actually at Polyev headquarters, so we are going to check in with him.
Yeah, so we're here. One of the things I really kind of noticed was that this room is only maybe half full. It's a very big room here at the what's called the Rogers Centre. It used to be the Shaw Centre, but very strange in a way. Ottawa is not known as being a conservative stronghold area, but if you saw the amount of people that were coming out, you know, to the rallies that the Conservatives had, there was a lot of people, you know, so it is a bit odd. I found that there wasn't that here, whether the Conservatives kind of resigned themselves to different result than they'd like. Of course, there was some cheers and things when they announced the minority government, and for the Liberals, now it's sort of hanging on to see if they can stop them and hold on, stop the Liberals in the minority. But it seems the way the seats are coming out, it may sort of really be BC that determines whether the Liberals get a minority or majority. But that's kind of the sort of not a full room here, and not overly happy, obviously, with kind of the results so far. And I'll head back to you now, Winnipeg.
Thank you, Fraser. We now head to Winnipeg Center. That's where we find our Sierra Bettens, who brings us this update. Oh, sounds like we lost Sierra. We'll try to get back to her as soon as we can. Time to go back to our Angel Moore, who is at the Jaime Baptiste HQ in Cape Breton. With over 80% of the polls being accounted for, it looks like he'll be heading back to Ottawa. Here's Angel and Jaime Baptiste.
Hello, Winnipeg. Hello, APTN. It's very good to be with you tonight. Yeah, I'm feeling really good. This is the third time I've been elected as a member of Parliament. I'm one of the few members of Parliament who actually live on a First Nations reserve, the community of Agecoutay. They came out for me tonight. They came out in record numbers in the advance polls. I'm very, very proud to continue to be their MP, but I'm also very proud to continue to be one of the only First Nations in the House of Commons who lives in a First Nations reserve, and that means I can continue to advocate for those people who live on the reserve. I can continue to advocate for the things that we need to do to advance reconciliation, to close the gap, to advance economic reconciliation, but address the harms of colonization and the lack of implementation of treaty rights. And so I'll be there to continue to work hard for not just my riding of Cape Breton, Canso, Antigonish, but Indigenous people all across Canada.
One more thing, don't you tell me about this picture you have here?
Well, one of the things is that just being in First Nations communities, we have to deal with grief, we have to deal with loss. In February 22nd, exactly 1 month before the election call, I lost my best friend who was with me from every single campaign, who was my wingman, my right-hand man, Arnold Sillaboy from the community. I grew up with him. We started off being youth coordinators together. When I ran to be an MP, he was with me. He was part of my staff, and I lost him to a massive heart attack 1 month before we called an election. I really didn't know if I could do this, but a lot of people helped me to get to where I am tonight. A lot of people asked me to keep going, and I feel like he's here with me in spirit. I miss him greatly, but I know that he would have wanted me to keep going, and I'm proud to do this today, but I wouldn't be here without him.
Thanks so much, Angel. Thanks to Jaime there. Congrats to him. We're going to throw it over to our Mike McDonald now, who's also standing by with a guest in Sault Ste. Marie, Algoma.
Thanks a lot. I'm here with Sault Ste. Marie Algoma candidate, NDP candidate, Laura Mayer. Probably not the night you were expecting to have or wanted to have. What are your thoughts on tonight?
I think we always knew that it was going to be a tough battle here, that with the new riding, the NDP is always about a grassroots movement, and it takes time to build that up. And I think that over this campaign, we've really created the connections that we need to do to carry us forward into the next election.
What do you think? What do you think happened with the result overall? I mean, we're looking nationally. There's only a few seats that the NDP seem to have right now. What do you think happened?
I think that overall it's been, the ballot question has really been about the tariffs, and people are incredibly, they're worried, right? And I think that across the country that's translated into really broad Liberal support, because that's really a representation of the status quo. And, for the NDP, it's been an uphill battle the entire campaign.
We don't know yet whether it's going to be a majority or a minority government. If it is a minority government, we could be doing this again in fairly short order. Do you think you're going to run again under the NDP banner?
I think that I've made a lot of connections in that I have been asked already to put my name in the ring again. So I absolutely will be back.
All right. Well, you certainly have some supporters behind you. They kind of gathered without saying anything, so that's a little bit of a surprise here. Yes. We'll send it back to the desk.
Thank you, Mike. That brings us back to our HQ studio here in Winnipeg to talk more about those ridings we were just in with our guests. Let's start off with Winnipeg Senator Negon. We mentioned her earlier, but NDP. Pardon me. We'll throw it to Jennifer. Jennifer, we mentioned it earlier, but NDP MP Leah Gazan led with just over 50% of the vote in 2021, with about a 20% gap between the Conservatives. Do you think she will come out on top this time around tonight?
It's hard to say. She's very close, and the Liberals are picking up a lot of support. And like I was talking about earlier with those accessible voters, if the NDP are feeling like they're letting down voters, they will swing to Liberal. And also, again, voting strategically, that we've been hearing so much about that voting strategically piece, that even in some areas where the Conservatives might not even be an option, we're still seeing people put their votes over to the Liberals, and that might cause quite a few NDPers to lose their seats. And Leah Gazan might be one of them.
Cassidy, what about, there you are, Nigan. Did you want to weigh in on Winnipeg Centre there and what we're seeing with Leah Gazan?
Well, absolutely. Like it's a dogfight for Leah Gazan that she's in probably the fight of her life. I mean, according to my tracking, is that she's still got a pretty significant 4-point lead within the riding, which at this point of the night suggests that it will be tight, but I think certainly she will be able to probably eke this out because we're at the point of the night in which the advanced polling starts to become part of the numbers. In many ways, they leave the advanced polling to the end of the counts for most ridings in the country. There are some special exemptions for that. But generally, the advanced polling, which we know that those who came out early are people who generally tend to vote more progressive. And they may be Liberal, but they probably are closer to the NDP. So, I mean, it all depends on whether Leah Gazan will be able to hold on this fight. The fact is she's running against a candidate that wasn't expected to do well at all, was a person who was a virtual unknown in the riding, Rahul Walia. And this person, was in charge of the Liberal Party in Manitoba for the youth wing, but generally had no foothold within the riding, really didn't have a very strong ground game. And so we'll see whether that person will come back to challenge Leah Gazan, but I really doubt it.
Jennifer, what about Desenath, the Mississippi Churchill River? Your thoughts on where that's at? Bucky Belanger and the Liberals in the lead there.
Desenath, Mississippi Churchill. Stay with me again. I had to say that word a whole lot when I was a staffer for an MP because it's the riding right next door, so it took me a few years to get it to. Just DMC is what I tell people. Just refer to it as DMC. Very, very close from what I was seeing the last time I checked. I haven't actually done an update in a couple minutes here, but it looks like there isn't many polls.
40 points.
Yeah, they only have 7 of the 88 polls counted, but some of those polls are very, very small because of how remote some of those communities are and the polling stations in them. So some of those polls might come in and you might see a huge margin for the leader, but right now they're only like 15 votes apart.
Cassidy, your thoughts on Desenath, Mississippi Churchill River riding?
Yeah, so it looks like Buckley's quite in the lead now with the latest count. That was, as Jennifer mentioned, that was Gary Vidal's previous riding. The region got redistributed with the new distribution, bringing in a lot more Métis communities. So to have both Buckley and then Jim LeMay running against each other, I knew it might be tight, but it also might be the first little splotch of red in the province of Saskatchewan. What's most significant for me, and I think a lot of the communities in the north there, is that riding is going to be home to Isle La Crosse, Saskatchewan. For me in particular, my heart is always in Isle La Crosse, Saskatchewan, with the survivors of the Isle La Crosse boarding school. They just right before this election was called, finally got to an agreement in principle with the federal government to recognize the survivors of Isle La Crosse boarding school. That has been in the works for decades now. Those survivors fighting for the recognition that they so deserve. And so that agreement in principle was signed right before this election. So, I do think that that community specifically might have a little bit of a leg up with the Liberals. And so to see Buckley leading there, I'm not surprised, and we'll see what happens once the polls are counted.
And Cassidy, also important to note, Bucky Belanger, who looks like he won that riding, a long-time MLA within Saskatchewan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so was, Jim LeMig, not a long time. I think he served the one term there, didn't win his seat. He ran just in this last Saskatchewan election. He was an advocate for those communities in the province of Saskatchewan, but maybe not so much to garner their vote for the federal election.
Nigan, some Indigenous candidates are definitely heading to Ottawa. Jaime Batiste, who we just heard from, he's going to win his riding. Mandy Gull-Masti in the lead there as well. In 2021, there were 77 Indigenous candidates, a record at that time, only 45 this time around. What do you think was behind the big drop there?
I think there was a general feeling with Justin Trudeau's government that there was high expectations, not as much delivered as perhaps expected. That tells more about Liberal over-promising than it really does about the fact is the Liberals got a lot done in their term. Maybe not enough, but certainly created a sense of maybe historical mistrust. Certainly gave a feeling that what was early, what I was often calling sort of a Trudeau mania, a mini Trudeau mania in 2015, carrying into the 2019-2021. And then you add in all of the different ways in which Justin Trudeau kind of created a combative relationship with Indigenous peoples near the end, and Jody Wilson-Raybould being right at the center of that. It created kind of a sense of apathy of Indigenous peoples participating in government. But there are going to be some very strong first-time MPs this time around. I'm watching very closely, and we were talking about this earlier. There are two ridings, the Desnathay, Miss Snippy, Churchill River, as we spoke about before. But the big one, Churchill Kiewit-Nukoski, that one I don't screw up the name on. Rebecca Chartrand has gone a commanding lead and is leading longtime 17-year incumbent Nikki Ashton, who was got a lot of advocacy done over 17 years, but most recently was involved in some financial issues, was kicked out of the NDP critics role for some of her choices during the pandemic of traveling when even her own incumbents on First Nations weren't allowed to travel. Nikki Ashton's looks like she's headed right towards another career for tonight. Rebecca Chartrand is absolutely looking towards taking that riding. She's got a commanding lead, almost nearly 16%. And while it's not nearly as many votes counted as in northern Saskatchewan, it's looking like the trending is looking for Rebecca Chartrand. That may tighten. And so many of those first-time MPs will be sitting around the table with Mark Carney, and it will be a different kind of Liberal Party. This is not going to be the Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau. It's going to be a much more centrist party, a much more resource agenda-specific party, and it's also, I think, going to be a party that is not as engaged in looking at reconciliation or Indigenous rights, but will have to, because Chapter 1 of every conversation involving any sense of the economy or the environment or anything else, even involving Donald Trump in this country, has to involve conversations with Indigenous peoples, both constitutionally, but also socially. Canadians want that as well.
Jennifer, anything else you want to add on why fewer Indigenous people put their name forward as candidates this time around?
I think because the conversation around sovereignty is becoming so important, where, you know, our strong Indigenous people are heading towards, you know, leadership of their own nations and communities. I just realized that one of my election polls wasn't updating, so I was very off on the Desnathay Mississippi Churchill breakdown. But yeah, I think we're starting to see some of our strongest heading into our own systems that we're designing on our own, rather than putting their name forward to exist in Canada's parliament, especially as, you know, political parties start to tighten up what you can and can't do, and following party lines is so incredibly important. We don't leave much space anymore to have those like strong, fierce advocates, because we're so focused on keeping party messaging tight that I even think back to like Dr. Willie Littlechild when he was a PCMP, when he still had the ability to talk about Indigenous rights. And now if it's not something that directly aligns with the party or might be seen as unpopular, people don't want to really touch that. So it's hard to see our strongest, you know, put their names forward when they don't feel like they're going to have the space or flexibility to advocate for what matters for them.
Cassidy, there were 12 Indigenous people with a seat in the House of Commons prior to the election call. Any thoughts on whether that's going to go up or down here?
I mean, it kind of seems like it's going to go down. I think Leah Gazan is losing her seat. I'm still watching for the numbers on Edmonton Griesbach to see if Blake Desjardins is going to win his seat as an incumbent. I know it's going to be tight there. But again, with less people running, I think there's going to be less Indigenous peoples in the House of Commons, which is really, really too bad.
Mandy Gulmasti now not in the lead there anymore. Just looking at the numbers here, I mean, the Bloc's down, the NDP definitely down, the Green are where about you might think. Nigan, reflections on what we're seeing here? This is a pretty tight race here.
Well, I don't want to disagree with the numbers that you're seeing, but the numbers that I'm seeing is that Leah Gazan is fairly in the lead and looking very secure. I'm not sure where the idea is that she's losing her seat. Certainly the numbers that I'm looking at, that she's almost 5 points above, she almost a 500 vote lead. And unless there is some kind of massive turnaround, I think Leah Gazan has headed towards a victory in that particular riding. I suspect that there will be probably in the neighborhood of 10 Indigenous MPs. And the real question is whether Blake Desjardins can pull it out, but also some of the other ridings are in the country that are really early on in their polling is looking at some, for example, Ellis Ross out in the Conservative ridings out in BC. There are some ridings that I think we're certainly still waiting for, and the numbers in Desnathay, Nisnippy, Churchill River. There, Jen, are you proud of me yet? I think certainly there's a numbers that are still yet to come in, and so we'll certainly see Indigenous candidates headed to Ottawa, and those are all worth noting about, but maybe not in the same kind of vociferousness, the same kind of robustness as there was back in 2015.
Thank you to our guests. Now we head to Winnipeg Centre. That's where we find our Sierra Bettens, who brings us this update.
An incredibly tight race for...
Sierra, go ahead. What's
We're
going
here
on
in
there?
Winnipeg at We're here at Winnipeg Centre at NDP incumbent Leah Gazan's campaign headquarters, where there's an incredibly tight race between NDP incumbent Leah Gazan and Liberal candidate Rahul Walia. So with current numbers, we can see that Leah Gazan is leading with 39.65% of the vote in this riding, followed by Rahul Walia at 34.83% of the vote. So while we don't know who will win this race yet, what we do know is that this riding has been held by an Indigenous candidate since 2015, and there is deep community roots in this riding. There's a huge arts and culture scene. It's very diverse, and it's also identified by the Assembly of First Nations as one of 36 ridings where First Nations voters could have a significant impact. And so during her tenure, Gazan has advanced a lot of community-based initiatives. So, whether the Liberals or the NDP take the seat in this riding, it's going to require a dedicated community leader.
Broken head for TR right now? Nope. Okay, so we're going to stay here in Winnipeg at HQ and check in with our Savannah Kelly now.
What do you need? Here we go. They're trying to go to me on that.
Savannah, are you ready to give us an update on and you're not either. That's okay. Let's just talk a bit more here about the numbers while we wait as our reporters get themselves into places. Jennifer, your overall thoughts on what we're seeing so far? Nobody's getting close to that 172 just yet, 159 to 142.
Yeah, I actually had just sent you a note because I wanted to talk about the Western separatism piece, and I feel like that is the elephant in the room right now that we're all thinking, but nobody wants to say it out loud, is that when you're seeing ridings in Saskatchewan right now where we have a lot of we were an entirely conservative province going into this election, but when you're seeing some of those stronghold ridings that are sitting at 85% of the vote right now, that is an incredibly strong mandate. So if the Conservatives are not able to, get in the way of the Liberals forming another government, what does that look like? Number one, for the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre's leadership, and also that conversation from people out west here that have already been tiptoeing around that idea of if we lose the election, what's next? Because I'm getting a little bit concerned on what's going to happen from here when you have ridings that are that conservative. How are they going to take this news?
Very important point to make there, Jennifer. Thanks for that, guests. We'll definitely come back to you again. We have TR. We're going to throw it to her in Broken Head, Ojibwe Nation at South Beach Casino, Chartrand HQ. Go ahead, TR.
Hey guys, so yeah, as you said, we're here in Broken Head. You know, I'm here actually with Rebecca Chartrand right now. She's the Anishinaabe candidate here. You know, Rebecca, oh, she's just waving to everybody right now. They're kind of doing a mic check. But you know, early numbers say you're 45%. How are you feeling right now?
I don't even know what to say. I'm just so excited. Our team worked so hard. This isn't about me, it's about all of us. And yeah, I'm celebrating this team. So very excited.
You know, some of the early numbers in the First Nations, you're taking the First Nations polls. Like they said, there's about 64% First Nations, well, Indigenous voters in the riding.
Right.
Just talk a little bit about how you've managed to take those.
Yeah, so we worked really hard to get into our communities. This riding has nearly 80% Indigenous people, so it was important for us to get out there. I'm First Nation myself, and I know how important it is to represent ourselves. We've seen a continuum, you know, in terms of our leadership rise, but this is the next step. We have to be present at all levels of government, and we need to be at the table.
You know, and some of the issues, you know, big issues, of course, infrastructure, on all access road, healthcare. Maybe just talk about what you heard on the ground while we were over there.
Yeah, we heard a lot. Like, the issues are pretty much the same across the board. Housing is an issue. People want good jobs. We've seen a lot of progress with clean drinking water in the communities. We're seeing more schools and health centers in the community, but that's just the beginning. There's still a ways to go. Like, people are focused on the economy as much as Mark Carney is, but there's regional aspirations in terms of what that could look like. You know, the Port of Churchill, the rail line, critical minerals. We know that this has to be an Indigenous-led solution when we're looking at economic development, specifically in this riding.
And of course, NDP Nikki Ashton, she held this riding since 2008. Before that, you know, Tina Keeper, 20 years before that, Elijah Harper. Any last words on just, you know, the legacy of the people before you?
Yeah, I think, you know, Tina Keeper's definitely an idol and a role model to so many. I know Nikki Ashton has been there in the opposition position, but, you know, the party, as we've seen tonight, will not form government. So it's smart. I think strategic voting that's happening. I think our people are waking up to participating in all levels of government because, you know, we weren't able to vote until about 60 years ago. And so our people are like, okay, yeah, it's time to get up and vote and participate in these systems as much as we're trying to change them. So we need people inside and outside trying to create that change. So this is the people speaking. Like, that's what this is.
Absolutely. So thank you for your time tonight, and we'll continue to watch those polls. Back to you, Creeson and Dennis.
Thank you, TR. That's TR Wheatley reporting live from South Beach Casino with Rebecca Chartrand. We now go to our digital media editor, Savannah Kelly, who is live in our APTN Winnipeg newsroom to give us a roundup on social media during this election. Savannah?
Thank you, Creeson. It's a big night across the country, and unsurprisingly, we're seeing a lot of opinions in our comment sections online. I'm here to share some of the comments we've been getting tonight so far. Online, we asked, how do you want to see the next federal government approach Indigenous issues? Canadian 1959 said, we want clean and potable water on every reserve yesterday. I don't care how much it costs. I want Indigenous and Inuit educators and elders teaching the history of this country from an Indigenous perspective in every school in this country on the federal ticket. Stephen Maltese said, there needs to be a federal task force that investigates the disappearances of missing and murdered Indigenous women. When Native women go missing, they are not investigated as thoroughly as they would be if they were reported murdered. Kevin Guillen, also known as Sketchy 1492 on Threads, said, by honoring the treaties, then seek ways to create new treaties that include the rights of Mother Nature and the future sustainability of the next 7 generations. We also asked online what voters want to see the next federal government accomplish within the first few months of being elected. Vizul on X said, lower rents, raise wages to something people can live and thrive on, but it's never going to happen because they all work for the wealthy, not the working class. User Caps on X is looking back at an old election promise that the previous Liberals didn't keep. They said electoral reform so I can vote my beliefs, not my fears. As for the election results that are continuing to roll in, it looks like this user will see the result they hoped for. Can Paper Chase on TikTok said, I'm hoping to see a Liberal victory so that we can distance ourselves from the MAGA-style divisiveness and policies. But cost of living was on the mind of one user on TikTok. Mo Blessing said, all the people who voted Liberal can't complain about prices in Canada. And finally, Standing White Buffalo on TikTok shared a poetic thought on their thoughts about the parties, saying the left and right wings belong to the same bird. The election results are still rolling in, so keep sharing your thoughts with us. You can comment on our stream on TikTok or tag us in your comments on X, Blue Sky, or Threads. Back to you in studio.
Good stuff. Thanks, Savannah. We're going to throw it back to our Ottawa studio where Kim and Veldon and Peter are standing by. Kim?
We are looking at those numbers, Creeson and Dennis, 156 Liberals, 146 Conservatives. It is much tighter than we thought last time we spoke here in Ottawa. How are we feeling now?
Well, I'll withdraw my my majority lead, and but maybe it's definitely going to be a Liberal government.
Definitely. We did see some very good points come up with our team out west. Some good points, though, is that we did discuss the fact that there are fewer Indigenous candidates this time around compared to last election. Do we think that that means fewer voices for our issues?
Well, first of all, fewer Indigenous candidates, probably because it was called on such short notice, the election, and there was a scramble for candidates. As it happened in Nunavut, I know personally people who called me for advice, what do I do here? Because they had been asked to make a decision within 24 hours. I think that's one
the scramble,
factor.
yes.
Another is a despondency. I don't know, but I hope not. Yes, numbers talk. More numbers, more candidates mean probably, likely more MPs elected who are Indigenous, but I don't think it necessarily means that they don't have a voice. As I mentioned earlier tonight, when I was an NDP member, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, who was Romeo LeBlanc at the time, father of the current LeBlanc, I believe, sent me to Europe, and I spoke in Strasbourg in the European Parliament on the sealing issue, because that was not just important to Nunavut people, but to either side of Nunavut, as well as Newfoundland people. So it was a Canadian matter, and so that was pan-party. And I think this could relate to, make Indigenous lives matter by being more being more pervasive, being more diplomatic, if you will, and not so opposition, because they're not so partisan. And my advice to whoever is coming up the pipe as a new MP or re-elected Indigenous people, try to think strategically, even on the Hill, and try to think about the fact that you are there for your people, and secondarily for the party. It's advice from an old man.
A very good advice from an old man. I have to say that one thing that the Liberals did bring on, the AFN said, didn't take the deal, but child welfare, Bill 92, something that is very big, but not talked about a lot in this election. We are seeing numbers quite close, maybe a 6-seat difference right now between the Liberals and the Conservatives. If the Conservatives do win more votes, that offer may be receded. And what happens to our people in that case when it comes to child welfare?
When you say vote, you mean more members?
Yeah. Right.
Or translating into more members for the Conservatives?
Right now, there are more, yes.
Oh, Well, considering what's been said by the leader of the Conservative Party, they should learn to work hard rather than being compensated for residential school wrongs. At least there's an admission at the end there. I mean, this goes back to John A. Macdonald and his dictum, his edict, his decree that we'll take pardon my usage of this word, we'll take the Indian out of the Indian and assimilate them. And it stems from that up to today. The relationship between, pardon me, between Europeans and first peoples of North America has been horrendous.
Yes.
The other day on social media, there was a discussion about the Royal Charter of 1655 of the Hudson's Bay Company, and that it's going to be auctioned off.
Yes.
Well, it should be given to the Inuit or the First Nations, and because, I mean, a stack of fox pelts this high as a rifle, to pay for a rifle. That rifle was bought for many, many, many times what it would have been bought for in the U.S., in England, in France, and they ripped off North American Indigenous people big time. That's just one small example. And then the pervasive attitude of, an a priori perfunctory sense of superiority, a complex. And that imbalance of power persisted even up to today, less now, but it's still there, and people still feel it. And it's a lousy history. When we say reconciliation, I often think about, well, what is the definition of reconciliation? It means that things were better at one time in the past. Well, what are we reconciling to?
That is so well explained, because a lot of people get confused when we talk reconciliation. And I actually wanted to bring up economic reconciliation, because that is something that both Poilievre and the Liberals have brought up and say that in their vision, economic reconciliation actually means planning for Indigenous ownership opportunities, planning for resource projects to have that Indigenous voice, planning, but I don't hear doing. Is that?
Well, I think in this economic reconciliation is that if we think about the whole state of the economy and what the shakeup of the global economy is going to see with more tariffs, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow too. What President Trump is going to do based upon the outcome of today's election. I don't know if he took his foot off the pedal or what have you. But on the one hand, so we can look at the expenditures of the past Liberal government too, and the deal that they've been working on. But we should recognize that it is Dr. Cindy Blackstock who's been at this for almost 20 years. Back when Pierre Poilievre, at the same time, when Pierre Poilievre, a year before Pierre Poilievre stood up in the House of Commons, or actually it was in the on a radio station on the day of the national apology for Indian residential schools, and made those contemptible, deplorable statements that signal how he would treat children and the compensation for the discrimination. Carrying forward those attitudes, those words, is that they ought to learn the values of hard work. Is they couch within economic reconciliation. The idea is that you're going to work for the reconciliation, and we want access to your resources as well too. So it disguises the fact that they do want to repeat what we were just talking about with the Hudson Bay Charter is coming in to exploit and extract the surpluses of what's within our own territories. And that he does not, we should expect him to not be amenable to advancing what Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller had accomplished with historic levels of expenditures. So when we enter into a recession, and this is sort of a roundabout conversation of expenditures, saying we might need stimulus, and that'll be larger federal budgets, and the government will play a larger role in the economy when there's economic downturn, that a Liberal government might be amenable to, finally compensating those who will inject funds into the economy. I would not see that the same way from Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives bent, because they just already seem hostile towards, they want to take rather than give and make amends for those past harms. So the flow of large numbers let's give credit to Mark Miller for what he achieved in his time as, at first, Indigenous Services Minister, and my own community that lived through a drinking water advisory since July 2008.
Wow.
We finally got money to break ground last summer for a water treatment plant, and we lived through it. And we are 160 kilometers away from one of the largest and richest national capitals in human history.
That's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that there's still communities in Quebec, Kitsekik, getting electricity this year. And they're like, okay, so when's water coming?
Right. Yeah.
So there are some issues, basic issues like that a lot of Canadians don't realize are issues. It's funny that you talked about give and take and money. When it comes to Poilievre, a lot of his promises were about pro-business plans and the low tax proposal, carbon tax. What do we say to that as we see numbers rising? Right now, it's only like a 4-seat difference from our numbers here. I don't know if it's different. We might have a slower update on our screen, but
well, I just don't think. I think historically, conservative governments have been considerably more hostile towards Indigenous interests in closing the socioeconomic gap and saying, well, pull up your bootstraps, while at the same time, holding us down with one hand and taking with the other. We've had to fight through courts, and by we, Cindy Blackstock, once again, almost 20 years, and one of the first decisions which held them to it in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal came in January 2016. So we're 9 years out from finagling a deal with the Liberal government to right past wrongs, which I would not see the Conservatives coming to the table very. I mean, they're not ones to negotiate. Is that we actually have to go through the judiciary to hold their feet to the fire.
do you agree?
Anything he says, I agree with. I just want to mention that Mr. Poilievre and others of his ilk are not the Conservatives of the days when Diefenbaker, Stanfield, even Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Clark were around. They are the spawn of a Reform Party gone conservative. And I think there's quite a difference between the two. And I have heard from Indigenous people, Inuit, who have met with Mr. Poilievre and liked him very much.
Okay.
On a personal level. On a policy level, I'm not sure. Whether he would change if he became Prime Minister from the contemptible statements that you mentioned that he's made before because he's the Prime Minister, or whether he would follow in the vein of the President south of the border and say whatever comes up in his head. So that remains to be seen. Economic reconciliation, was there ever, when you're paying $20,000 in 1850 for a rifle that cost $5 or £5 in England, is that what we're reconciling to? I don't think so. We need new agreements. The treaties in Ontario that I worked for the Ontario government for a while. Treaties I've read, what was omitted from telling the people sitting on the ground through an interpreter, as long as the trees are growing, as long as the sunshine, you will, and they omit to say the codicil or the line, the clause that says, unless mineral is found underneath your land. And
we have a lot of like the Magpie, for example, that is now, a lake with its own political entity. It has its own personhood. Do we have to start protecting our land in that way for politicians to not be able, if Carney does, not Carney, I mean, if the Conservatives do get closer in the race, is that something we should worry about? Should we go to court more often? Should we?
Well, I find that most of the I guess, victories or triumphs that Indigenous peoples have had in Canada have had to be forced through the judiciary rather than at the negotiation tables. Sometimes the bureaucracy becomes its own political beast, that despite what the minister might say, that there is Department of Justice lawyers who say, well, you know what, let's not make a precedent here, and therefore fight to the death. They're the largest law firm in Canada versus, these small, if we could point to Clyde River once again, it was David versus Goliath.
Yeah. The biggest delegation of Quebec elected chiefs have gone to the UN this past week just to say, like, we're always fighting in court. Is this what it has to be? So it'll be interesting to see how we move forward. Numbers are getting tight. It's a race of back and forth between the Liberals and the Conservatives. So we are going to head back to our HQ at Creeson and Dennis and see what's happening over there.
Thanks so much, Kim, Peter, and Veldon. We're going to check in now with our reporter Rachel May, who is in the current Conservative riding of Saskatoon West. Rachel, what's the mood out there tonight? Conservatives still have a lot of seats here.
Hi, I'm here in Saskatoon West. It's a very exciting time. We have a crowd of people behind me, NDP supporters, who are very hopeful that Rachel Lowen-Walker, the NDP candidate, will be taking the seat. Saskatoon West is one of 36 ridings identified by the AFN that First Nations voters could decide federal election outcomes. When we think about the houses in this district, there's over 60,000 houses. And from what I've heard, Rachel Lowen-Walker has knocked on every single door. That is unheard of. And up until the polls closed at 7:30 Saskatchewan here, she had continued knocking on doors. So much so that she's not quite here yet, as she was out there having conversations with people, hearing what the needs are. She told me when we spoke previously that being in a region where First Nations and Métis voters are so prevalent really showcased her the needs of the community and what's important. Things like housing, things like overdoses, that has been rampant here in Saskatchewan, unfortunately. In Saskatoon, we have seen an unprecedented amount of overdoses. And so that was something that she really took to heart, something that she was very passionate about. The supporters here are hopeful that she still will be getting a seat so that she can enact those changes. And she said even if she does not become the candidate for this riding, she's hoping that the candidate will step up and take charge of things like housing and addictions. So that's what we're hearing here in Saskatoon West right now. I'm Rachel May here in Saskatoon West. Back to you in Winnipeg.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Now we're going to go back to our Savannah Craig, who is in Ottawa Mark Carney headquarters at TD Place Arena. Savannah, bring us up to speed on what's going on there with this back and forth.
Percentage points, but kind of only.
Well, everyone is waiting on the man of the hour. There's lots of excitement here. The crowd seems to be growing stronger with excitement, with each Liberal candidate that is being announced behind us. There's still no word yet on when we might be seeing Mark Carney himself deliver a speech, but what we can confirm now is it's a really strong two-party race here between the Conservatives and the Liberal government, and the excitement is growing strong here.
Redistribution changed this riding and made it look a lot more favorable.
Thanks so much, Savannah. I'm sure we'll be checking in with you one more time, but check back in here now with our guests in studio and joining us on the line. Cassidy, your takeaway from the current election results we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's close. We know that it's going to be a Liberal government, but still, are we going to be a majority? Are we going to be a minority? Just going back to who we are as Indigenous peoples, no matter what, we're going to keep building our own nations. This election is obviously really important. It's important to know where each of the parties stand with Indigenous priorities across the country, but there's been so much movement towards self-determination and self-government treaties, self-government agreements in this country that, no matter the results of this election, it's just really important to remember that we as Indigenous peoples are still building this nation, and I'm excited to see what happens tonight. I'm excited to see, what happens with our Indigenous candidates, but always good to remind ourselves that we as Indigenous peoples, we're nation builders ourselves, and we have a lot of work to do within our own nations.
Jennifer, this is a pretty even split here. Your thoughts on what we're seeing between the Liberals and the Conservatives?
Well, we definitely saw the race tighten in the last 20 or so minutes, which is, a lot of these ridings were very, very close to begin with. So some of the early projections where there might have just been a couple polls counted was telling us that we saw a larger margin, especially earlier on tonight. But now we're seeing, there's only about 8-9 seats difference between the two. It's going to be, I think, quite difficult for the Liberals to govern again as a minority, especially with the NDP being weakened. They're essentially going to need to rely a lot on the Bloc for support. But what does that actually look like? And one interesting thing we're seeing in Carleton is that Pierre Poilievre is at risk of losing his seat. There is already a margin that's growing and growing, and that I think signals something. That might mean that the Conservatives aren't that unpopular. They are picking up seats, but the incumbent MP in that riding might not even be able to hold his seat, especially as his party is still doing quite well across the country. 149 seats projected right now, which is more than what they had. But yeah, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, may just lose his seat tonight.
Yeah, that's pretty wild stuff there right now. I don't know what the percentage is on the people who voted there, but yeah, Nigan, you want to weigh in on?
Let's not jump the fence here. Those are the advanced numbers. Those are about 10 polls out of 266. We got a long way to go in Carleton. They can't count those ballots because there are 91 names on that ballot. It's well documented that activists jumped into that riding, wanted to make a point about the problems of first past the post democracy, wanted to make a statement about the kind of problems that it is like without proportional ballots. A whole bunch of reasons why there's 91 candidates, most of them activists who are just running for the sake of trying to be disruptors. Pierre Poilievre is, I agree, he's behind 1,400 votes. Normally, we might say that is a very significant loss, but I think that let's wait to see what the actual numbers of people who voted today look like. We know that progressive people vote ahead of time, so we're not surprised. The one race that's really worth watching, Winnipeg Centre, Leah Gazan's lead has shrunk to just a few thousand. What's it looking like is it's looking for actually under 1,000, I'm sorry, about 500 votes. And so it's a tight race, but it's looking consistently for Leah Gazan. The two big stories of this election are Ontario seems to be not the Liberal march that it was. Quebec is actually the site in which we saw the most amount of Liberal support increase, and the polls were correct. I know, we lose a lot of faith in polling. We say things like, well, we look at the United States, we see, Kamala Harris was slightly ahead of Donald Trump in the final days of the US election. Looks like polling was absolutely correct in this election. It was within a few percentage points. The Conservative vote is inefficient because it's predominantly run through Alberta and Saskatchewan. And what that means is about a 10-seat Liberal seats ahead of the Conservatives. Unfortunately, because of the loss of the NDP and the fact that the Liberals are winning most of their seats from the Bloc and the NDP, we're seeing a very strong series of Conservative support, which might have stayed quite consistent the entire race. And we see Liberals taking seats from Blocs and from the Bloc and NDP, and they will not be able to form a full majority. And Jennifer's right. We may be seeing a government that will be very temporarily in office. And we may be doing this just in a few weeks, a few months, maybe even a year from now, because that government will not survive with the Bloc being a significant form of that government. It will fall. And of course, we're still early describing that, but If we see no party reach 172 seats, it will be a brief time in office for Mark Carney.
And Niigaan, it looks like the NDP might be wiped off the map here. You know, they have to get the 12 seats. They're at 10 right now. Your thoughts on where the NDP are at tonight?
Yeah, again, polling, I think Eric Renier from, the RIT is a good friend of mine. We've been on a few podcasts together. I think pollers get a hard time these days. We say, oh, they're made up or the polls aren't correct. Polls are completely correct this election and showed that the NDP was in for major losses. They were probably going to be halved, if not less so. Them not reaching the 12 seats of official party status means that they will be in the wilderness. Parties have come back from this before. Let's not forget that the very famous loss from the post-Brian Mulroney years, the Conservatives went all the way down to 2 seats. Which resulted in a massive rebuilding project for the Conservatives. I think the NDP can probably come back from this, but I think that they will need a great deal of rethinking, reanalysis, a big identity crisis, as Jennifer pointed earlier.
Jennifer, it looks like Billy Morin's going to win his riding. Your thoughts on that?
I think that's great news. Billy Morin is somebody that I know personally, and I think he would be an excellent person sitting in Parliament. He was a great leader for his nation and just all around a person that seems to, be very, very forward thinking and wants to see a lot of prosperity brought back to nations. And, he has led the nation. And he's also been the Grand Chief of the Confederacy at Treaty 6 as well. So I have full faith in Billy Morin. And I also am glad to see our people in running in all of these different political parties, because at the end of the day, we do need that representation at the table with every single one of these parties. So I'm glad to see that it's Billy Morin that might be at that table.
Jennifer, we'll throw to Cassidy. What do you think were some of the factors that put the Conservatives lower in the polls, and just how much is at stake here for the Conservatives?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot was at stake. Right before the election was called, they were polling super high. If the election had gotten called when Pierre Poilievre was calling for it before Trudeau resigned, they would have won a sweeping majority. Some people have said, and I've thought it myself, Pierre Poilievre was actually very successful in the campaign that he was running before Trudeau stepped down. Axe the tax, call an election, get rid of Trudeau. He was successful in all of those things. He got rid of Trudeau. The tax has been axed, but the timing was off for the Conservative Party, and timing is everything. And so, because of that, the polls have completely switched. And we'll see what happens with Poilievre's riding, but a total change in what we saw just a few months ago.
Another riding the NDP might lose there if those numbers hold, Blake Desjardins' riding. Niigaan, 9-10 seats for the NDP right now, but do you think there's still a chance here for them to be kingmakers in this next parliament?
Going to be very tough. Edmonton's not completely lost for the NDP. Edmonton Strathcona, Heather McPherson still held on to her riding fairly handily. She's not looking like she's in trouble. They haven't quite called that yet, but it's looking fairly steady. She's 12 points up. About 800 votes up. It's looking fairly strong. Edmonton's not completely lost for the NDP, but it is just like the rest of the country, with the exception of sort of northwestern British Columbia, where we're seeing some NDP ridings hold, ones that were predicted to perhaps be on unsteady ground. The fact is that the NDP is going to have a major issue going forward of where do they put their energy. And I think this is the point in the night where it's worth starting to begin the conversation of who is the next NDP leader, because Jagmeet Singh cannot continue. We may not see a resignation tonight because, a whole bunch of reasons why that might be. But I would say that generally we're probably going to see a new NDP leader coming in the next few weeks. If the NDP is kingmaker, though, or queenmaker, depending on how you want to talk about it, and I don't think the NDP will be in that boat as of yet. We're 161, the NDP seats are 9, that's 170. That's still not enough to make 172. that you'll see Jagmeet Singh stick around for a bit, try to navigate the NDP to the best position. But if Jagmeet Singh were to go into the next federal election, I don't think you'll get a lot of support within the NDP to be able to do that, and he'll certainly be up for a leadership review. Thanks to all of our guests. Our reporter Leanne Sanders is in Edmonton at the Blake Desjardins HQ, who is the incumbent for the Edmonton Giesbach riding, and is looks like Desjardins is behind in the polls. Leanne, fill us in on what's happening there this hour.
I am at the NDP election night headquarters in Edmonton, and one of the most closely watched ridings in this election is that of Edmonton-Griesbach, where the incumbent, the NDP's Blake Desjardins, stole the seat from Conservative Kerry Diot in the last election. Diot is on the ballot again this time around, as is the Liberals' Patrick Lennox. Lennox is expected to be a strong contender for the seat. He has a PhD in Canada-US relations, as well as working for the RCMP in a high-level bureaucratic position. Desjardins won by 1,468 votes over Diot in 2021. Desjardins said the NDP was the strategic vote in the riding this election, but with the Trump effect at play, it remains to be seen whether or not he can hold on to his seat against his opponents. This is one of the ridings where the Assembly of First Nations flagged as being one where Indigenous peoples could swing the vote. That is, if they got out to vote in the first place. Still remains to be seen. The other Edmonton riding I'm keeping an eye on tonight is Edmonton Northwest, where the former chief of the Enoch Cree Nation, Billy Moran, is running for the Conservatives. The last time there was a contest in that Northwest riding was back in 1993. It was abolished in 1996. There is a full slate of candidates in that newly drawn riding, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. An interesting side note is that Edmonton's Mayor, Amarjeet Sodhi, is favoured to win for the Liberals in Edmonton Southeast. Again, we'll have to see how that's going to play out. As you know, provincially, the Conservatives dominate, and in the last federal election, all but 2 seats went to the Conservatives. Back to you in studio.
Thanks, Leanne. We're going to head over to Ottawa now, where Fraser Needham's standing by at Pierre Poilievre headquarters. Fraser.
Well, the roller coaster ride of politics, I guess, right? So it's still not a very full room here. I don't know if in the future the Conservatives should book a room this big, but in Ottawa anyway, because it just doesn't have it's only about a half full or, still. But, obviously that disappointment when, they didn't, of course, it was confirmed on a Liberal minority, but it's looking like it's not turning out to be the campaign or the election that the Liberals thought either. The Conservatives took a lot of seats in Ontario, and it's really looking like a majority is out of reach now for the Liberals. We'll see what happens, but it's, so it's kind of buoyed the room up a bit, and they were saying that chant "Bring it on home." But really interesting thing is, last time I saw, Bruce Fanjoy was running ahead for the Liberals in Carleton ahead of Poilievre, so what a crazy situation that would be if the Liberals, they limited the Liberals to a minority, but at the same time the leader of the opposition loses his seat in Poilievre after winning it 7 or 8 times. So. Still lots to come here tonight, I guess, and we'll have to see what happens. And back to you, Winnipeg.
Thank you, Fraser. Time now to go back to the riding of Burnaby South in Vancouver, where the HQ of NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is. That's where we find our reporter Tina House. Tina, based on previous polls, fill us in what's happening there now.
Well, we've had more of a crowd than we did earlier tonight, but certainly there's a lot of frustration in the room. A lot of people were hoping it would go differently, but obviously by the look of the numbers, right now the party is just trying to get party status right now, so we'll see how it goes. But of course, everything's not been counted yet.
Tina, any word on the leader himself, if you're going to hear from him anytime soon?
Yes, there is word that Jagmeet Singh will make an appearance here this evening, but I'm not too sure when, but we're hoping to see him pretty quickly, yes.
Great, thanks, Tina. We're going to send it back to our Ottawa studio now, where Kim and Veldon and Peter are standing by.
Hey, thanks. So yes, things change quite fast in a very short time. It's interesting to see those numbers coming in. You were on your phone the whole time and calculating and looking and seeing. What are we talking about now? What's the...
Well, Liberal minority, and I think that's kind of what Peter was mentioning earlier tonight too. So, you know, I defer to his sage-like wisdom, and I think the numbers that we just saw would put the NDP having the balance of power to bring the 163 that the Liberals are leading with right now too. I think one of the larger stories too, although it's like, I think as Professor Sinclair Negan had mentioned, is it's too early to say in Pierre Poilievre's riding, but he seems to be sliding behind as the numbers roll in for him too. So
are we surprised?
In Ottawa, I'm not too sure.
If we're talking about Mr. Poilievre, he's held the seat for how many years? 22 years, 22. Something like that. But I've also heard that he barely won in previous elections.
Interesting.
And with the climate as it is politically today, yes, I'm a little bit surprised if he's indeed going to be losing his seat. But he's in the last few minutes, he seems to be catching up to Mr. Fanjoy. But certainly overall, I think we're going to be seeing a minority government. We could be wrong. The NDP have done a little bit better than expected. At one point a few weeks ago, they were projected to have maybe 3-4 seats, and now the projection is 10. Yeah. So a little bit better, but if the big story tomorrow, if it's going to be a minority government, okay, given, we'll look at that, etc. The big story will be if Mr. Poilievre loses, and what that will mean for the Conservatives, whether they bring back the progressive, name back into their name and swing to what they were in the days of Stanfield and Diefenbaker and Joe Clark and Mulroney and Kim Campbell to some point. Who remains to be seen.
Speaking of Kim Campbell, much earlier, when results were just starting to come in, we talked about, Kim Campbell short-lived. Negan Sinclair also mentioned this may be a short-lived win.
A government.
Is that something that you guys are?
Well, on a personal level, in 1979, I was really kind of angry at Mr. Bob Rae for putting forward a motion that brought down the Joe Clark government, because I like being an MP. Well, it could be a short-lived government, but likely not if we have Mr. Carney, which is what the majority of people, not the majority, but most people obviously want. If he continues as Prime Minister, we've got the man to fight off the existential perceived threat from the South, and an economist, a mature man, not too old, not too young, and all of this. So people will likely not want to have a fall down of the government, or whether it likely a minority. And so they probably wouldn't want a short-lived government too much. I, as a person, just a voter out on the street, man on the ground sort of person, let's work with this for now. Let's get away from elections and work with this. We've got something to deal with that's very, very real, and so whether if the opposition wants to bring down the government through a vote of non-confidence and so on, then they would have to think long and hard about it. I would think.
Yeah, I think so too. I think if an opposition party had voted to bring down the government very soon, like within 2 years, that they might be punished for it. Mr. Poilievre got the election that he had been fighting for, and it didn't turn out his way, and it might not even turn out personally for him, because he might not have his seat and may have to move out of Stornoway. And Yeah, this one was a little bit more high stakes for the Canadian population. So I don't know if they'd have the appetite to see somebody put their own personal opportunism forward again to say, you know what, I need another shot, another mulligan on this one, and then a do-over. And
well, on one level, personally, for Mr. Poilievre, I'm sure he's sweating buckets right now. But should he win, personally, in his own writing, and that could very well be, on the party level, is the party going to be disillusioned now with Mr. Poilievre as leader? Because a few weeks ago, it was his to take, and it was his to lose. And then the Trudeau transition to Mr. Carney brought about a whole new sense of optimism in the country with this man who was born in the Northwest Territories, by the way, in Fort Smith. Went to Harvard, a hockey player, something Canadians identify with.
Canadian.
Governor of the banks in 2 major countries of the world, and the man's credentials is a mile long.
You did mention, though, that, you know, we went for a bit of the safe, the right, the wrong, the fact that we have this economic threat coming from the South. But let's talk about the reality of we wake up tomorrow morning, leaders still there at the top. Trudeau came into power just a few years after Idle No More, the same year as the TRC tabled the last report. There was a swell of support for Indigenous activism. That was a decade ago, 10 years ago. So do we feel like Mark Carney, yes, we're all happy for our wallets and we're happy for the security of our economy, but do we think that he will be able to tackle Indigenous issues? Will he feel pressured to do so in the same way that Trudeau did?
Well, a number of things took a backseat during this particular campaign. Climate change, for one. Indigenous matters, for another. A few others that we're probably not really thinking of right now, because this matter from the South was so prevalent throughout this campaign. And interesting to me anyway, that during his first week as Prime Minister, Mr. Carney took a trip to Iqaluit, and that was telling, whether it meant that he cares about Indigenous affairs or whether it was more to make a statement about Arctic sovereignty. It's something else, I don't know. But I can't see Mr. Carney not thinking somewhat about Indigenous matters, because they're here to stay. And no matter how small, if you want to call it an Indigenous caucus on the Hill, call it that, no matter how small it is. Mr. Murray, Sinclair,
we have a loud voice.
and Trudeau, his first day as Prime Minister, said, that's my most important relationship is Indigenous affairs. And
we only have 2 minutes left. I just want to be able to let you say a thought on this.
Well, the only thing I have to say is, you know, it awaits to be seen, although Prime Minister Carney has already said, even in his visits overseas, is that he, you know, pointed to the flags flying in Montreal as like, well, you know, the pine cone, that is one of the symbols that represents Indigenous peoples. And that we figure into his view of Canada in a way that Conservatives have not. So Pierre Poilievre is cut from the cloth of the Harper government. They ignored us, Idle No More, and we, in large numbers, backed the Trudeau Liberals that brought them in for a majority in 2015. They'd be wrong to ignore us, and we'll make sure that we're heard.
Veldon Coburn, professor at McGill University of Political Sciences, Peter Itowar, thank you so much. First Inuk MP, wish you were still on the Hill, because we love to hear you, loved your anecdotes tonight, and very, very honored that you were our guest.
I missed the salary.
On that note, we will send it back to HQ in Winnipeg. Dennis Creeson, it's all yours.
A big thanks to Kim, Peter, and Veldon, and our APTN Ottawa crew. Hi, thank you for that. Cassidy, on the home stretch here, let's start with you. What does this very divided incoming parliament mean starting tomorrow?
I mean, if it's going to be this minority, it means that we're probably not going to see a lot of work get done. We saw that at the end of this last parliament, where things were tight and nobody was agreeing. Things were not getting done. If it's going to be a short government, if it's a minority government, there's a lot of priorities that Indigenous peoples are still looking to move forward on. The implementation of UNDRIP, we still want to see. We still want to see movement on C92, the introduction of clean drinking water legislation. We want to have more meaningful conversations about economic reconciliation, what that actually means to Indigenous nations, not just there's a pipeline, are you going to say yes? What can we do to make you say yes? We want to have more meaningful conversations about economic reconciliation. So there's so much that is being held up by the government. If it's a minority government, it's going to be really hard for us to be able to make movement on these issues. But we'll see. We've got strong voices. We've seen that throughout this election. Indigenous peoples have a loud voice. We have a strong role to play within the federal system. So just keep talking about these issues, keep raising them, and hopefully we can continue to make progress.
Nigan, this was obviously a divided parliament heading into this election. What do you think this result means for the days ahead?
It means that we're going to do this again in a short while, probably within a few months, maybe a year, because the way the parliament's sitting right now is simply untenable. Right now, the Liberals and the NDP together, which have worked together historically, I think the NDP will certainly find a much different dance partner in Mark Carney than Justin Trudeau, and there will not be the same kinds of bridging where, on certain policy issues, just on resources alone. Now, that's the glass half empty way of seeing these results. Here's a glass half full way. You're seeing probably the strongest Indigenous voices coming from the prairies, coming from areas in which Indigenous peoples are going to take up a large segment within the parliament. The handful or so of my count right now is 9 Indigenous candidates throughout the country. We're looking at probably most of those voices coming from basically northwestern Ontario, across the prairies, and will be significant in that those are some of the areas where we're seeing some of the most progressive trends in the country. I mean, it's worth noting that in Manitoba, you see a First Nations premier of a Canadian province, and I think that Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario should be really proud of themselves tonight by taking it upon themselves to invest their representation, Canadians, in Indigenous voices and in really strong Indigenous peoples who are smart, who are savvy, who have political experience. I think a few of them will find their way into the cabinet table, and so that's worthwhile. These are all things that I think not all the results are something that's to be sad about. My phone is blowing up right now with people who are like, this is not the result that I wanted. I'm depressed. This is not the kind of strong voice that we will in relation to Trump. So here's what I'm here to tell everyone out there is there are some good stories coming out of this election. And yes, we'll probably be doing this all again in a few months. So buckle up, everyone, and maybe book your future. Keep an eye out for a future APTN election coverage. I know Jennifer and I will be here, and hopefully Cassidy, who's been a great addition to our Truth and Politics crew here. But it will certainly be something we'll probably be doing this again soon.
Jennifer, your thoughts on what this next makeup of Parliament will be?
I'm so exhausted. And, Cassidy mentioned something about loud voices, and I feel like I'm one of those very, very loud voices. But I just wish we could make up our minds. It's like, can we all just collectively come to one agreement just for a little bit? Because I don't know if I can do this for another 6 months. And, all jokes aside, I am concerned about what this looks like to the President Donald Trump administration, because when we are not presenting a strong mandate with our federal government in Canada, I'm concerned about that, especially when he's been making, comments here and there about, Canada becoming the 51st state. And I think he's wholeheartedly serious about this. And seeing Canada this divided really, really concerns me.
Cassidy, your final thoughts here, takeaway from tonight? Do you think there's an appetite to go back to the polls here anytime soon?
I don't know that there's an appetite to, but I think there's going to be a need to. Like my panelists said, if we don't get the majority government, it's not going to work. There's just too much divisiveness within Parliament. Nothing's going to get done. We're going to be seeing the need to deliver a budget as soon as this election is over. And if we can't get agreement on the budget moving forward, then here we go again.
Yeah. Niigaan, Indigenous issues were largely left out of this election campaign. Do you expect that to continue in the next makeup of the House of Commons here?
It's going to be hard. It's going to be, I think, if there's one thing that the two major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, can agree upon, is that they certainly want to build an economy quickly. They want to so-called solve issues like the Ring of Fire, like lithium mining in Manitoba, like the automotive industry. They want to build an economy fairly quickly. We may see some movement on that, but here's the problem, is that one party, the Conservatives, are very, quote unquote, according to Pierre Poilievre, suspicious of what Indigenous rights are. And the Liberals are embedded in a process of saying, well, we've passed legislation recognizing Indigenous rights, therefore we have to bring our issues on concert with Indigenous rights. I don't know where that goes from there. And then you add Quebec sovereignty into the mix with the Bloc, and they'll say, well, why isn't Quebec having Quebec rights? And I don't mean to keep, I feel like I'm a broken record. I feel like I just traumatized Jen by saying we're all going to do this again fairly soon. So I'll just say is that it's going to be dysfunctional. And I think that in that vein, I'll ask this question. Will Pierre Poilievre continue to be a disruptor in politics? Because what got him to this point is being, for the most part, a person in opposition who very strongly appealed to a kind of disruption politics that also coincidentally overlaps, as a Venn diagram, is connected to a lot of Canadians that feel quite connected to Donald Trump. Will he continue in that vein? Because clearly he has not in any way grown the party. He's kept it almost significantly at his 35 to 37 point base. There's no growth there. He will not gain seats. The only reason that the Conservatives are even in the conversation tonight is because the Liberals and the NDP split about 30 seats in the country, and the Conservatives came right up the middle, and that they did not have the exact same vote count in most areas of the country. They picked up a few seats in Toronto, not because they grew their electorate, but because the Liberals and the NDP split the vote.
Jen, we were going to give you the last word, but we're almost out of time, and we know that you're exhausted anyways from this whole campaign, so we'll leave it at that. But a big thanks to you all, and that is going to wrap up our Decision 2025 special show for this election night here on April 28th.
We hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll have more election coverage tomorrow.
We're going to be speaking tomorrow with the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak will be here joining us, as well as Western University Assistant Professor Cody Grote. They'll both be here to break down all these election results.
From all of us at APTN National News, we thank you for watching and have a good night.